Good afternoon, everybody. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of civil society, colleagues and friends. You're all very welcome to today's 20th Annual Civil Society Forum. My name is Gerry Cunningham, the Director of the Human Rights Unit, and I'm very pleased to be your moderator for today. I want to thank you all very much for tuning in to today's proceedings. Before I start, let me offer apologies on behalf of our Secretary-General Joe Hackett, who had very much hoped to be here today, but as so often happens in this department, had to travel on business at short notice. As many of you may know, the Civil Society Forum is the key public event organised by the Human Rights Unit each year. The team here and our colleagues in New York and Geneva engage with many of our civil society partners on a regular basis in continuous dialogue, usually in relation to the Human Rights Council's specific events or cases. But today's forum is somewhat different. It provides an opportunity to take a step back from our day-to-day work and to consider selected overarching human rights themes. It's a chance to respond on what has been happening, how Ireland and the international community have responded, and to hear from those at the coalface in the UN, the EU and elsewhere, and indeed to look ahead. As ever, we have excellent panellists with us today, and the discussion will be very much enriched by your questions and comments, which you can ask via the Slido app. For wider introductions, please include your name and organisation in the questions. And that leads me then to the running order for today's proceedings. I will shortly introduce Minister Coveney, who will say a little bit about the context and the vision for today's event. And then we will hear a keynote address from the EU Special Representative on Human Rights, also former Taoiseach and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Eamon Gilmore. And Mr. Gilmore's address will then be followed by the two panel discussions. As you will have seen in the media, Minister Coveney has been extremely busy, both in the role as Minister of Foreign Affairs and as Minister of Defence. He's been very active, driven, and as a committed politician has most recently been to the forefront in Ireland's response to Russia's war in Ukraine, at home and abroad, and particularly at the United Nations Security Council. As many of you know, he's a huge supporter of civil society, and therefore it's my pleasure to introduce now Minister Coveney, who will formally open today's forum.
Distinguished guests, partners, friends, at the outset, I want to take the opportunity to remember two beloved colleagues, known to many of you and who we lost far too soon. The Department's legal advisor, James Kingston, and Ireland's Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN, Ambassador Jim Kelly. Both James and Jim loved their work and dedicated their working lives to making a positive difference in the world. In particular, I want to acknowledge James's contribution in the field of international human rights law and the International Criminal Court, and Jim's achievement at the UN Security Council, including his strong leadership on the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and in ensuring continued humanitarian assistance to Syria. Arieste, Garevan, Anamika, Delish. You're all very welcome to the 20th session of our Civil Society Forum. I want to thank everybody tuning in today for their ongoing work in the promotion and protection of human rights, both at home and abroad. I recognize that there is a loss inherent in having a virtual event, and we hope next year to return to business as usual in person. But in the meantime, this online event involves speakers beaming in from New York, Geneva, Brussels, France, and India. And I want to thank all of our speakers for your presence and contributions today. An interesting few hours lie ahead, and I know you'll be looking forward to hearing from EU Special Representative on Human Rights, Eamon Gilmore, who's joining us all the way from India. I want to thank Eamon and his team for going the extra mile to make sure that this was possible. In the sessions that follow, you'll hear from and have an opportunity to ask questions of our distinguished panelists. Ambassador Byrne-Nason and Gaffey will provide perspectives from New York and Geneva at a time when the UN is grappling with a range of serious conflicts, not least Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The UN Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights defenders, Mary Lawler, will bring an independent perspective to these discussions, drawing on her extensive civil society experience. The second panel will focus on corporate human rights and environmental due diligence, a field of growing importance globally. This is an opportunity to discuss the proposed Directive on corporate sustainability, due diligence. I'm pleased that we'll be joined by John Shine from the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, along with EEAS Senior Advisor on Trade Issues, Ngos Houghton, IBEX Director of Social Policy, Cara McGann, and Caoimhe de Barra, CEO of Trócaire, representing the Irish Coalition for Business and Human Rights. I want to also acknowledge Bríd O'Donoghue's steadfast and assured leadership as the independent chair of the implementation group for the National Plan on Business and Human Rights. But before handing over to Eamon, I do want to reflect a little on how the world has changed since the last Civil Society Forum in February of 2021. At that gathering, we looked ahead to Ireland's 2 years on the UN Security Council and the opportunities and challenges we faced in working to advance our core priorities, which were 3: building peace, strengthening prevention of conflict, and ensuring accountability. I don't think any of us anticipated the tumultuous period that would lie ahead for Afghanistan, for Ethiopia, for Myanmar, for Ukraine, and so many other states. Since the 24th of February, Russia's war on Ukraine has dominated the global geopolitical agenda as we witnessed a brutal assault on a sovereign state, resulting in injury, death, and incredible destruction. The response from the Irish people and the Irish government has been unprecedented. I visited Bucha myself 2 weeks ago on the back of an invitation from my counterpart, Minister Kuleba. There I saw at first hand trenches dug to bury multiple dead, a flattened and blackened city, and a devastated but courageous population bearing witness to inexcusable war crimes for which there must be accountability. I made clear at my subsequent address to the UN Security Council that we must do better to ensure timely, credible investigations take place where war crimes may have been committed. Since taking up our seat in the Security Council, we have advocated strongly for human rights, international humanitarian law, and the protection of civilians across all the work of the Security Council. We've worked hard to ensure that the indispensable role of civil society in building peace is at the heart of the Council's deliberations across its agenda. As Minister, I appreciate the support, counsel, and partnership that are helping us to be effective at the UN, and that includes many people in this room. I believe that creating and maintaining a safe and enabling environment for civil society to operate and contribute is critical to the promotion and protection of human rights globally. I'm proud of Ireland's leadership role on this issue at the UN, in New York, and in Geneva, including in initiating the resolution on civil society space, most recently adopted by consensus at HRC 47, and in ensuring that a record number of women civil society briefers addressed the UN Security Council during Ireland's presidency. I know Geraldine and Michael will speak in detail on our work at the UN, so I'll move on to our forthcoming presidency on the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, which begins next month. Ireland was a founding member of the Council of Europe in 1949, and its institution, which President Higgins has called the conscience of Europe, continues to be of critical importance for Ireland and Europe. During our presidency, we will pursue 3 clear complementary priorities. First, Ireland will reaffirm our founding freedoms, reinforcing human rights protection for civilians across Europe, above all through the effective functioning of the European Court of Human Rights. Second, in the face of rising illiberalism, we will draw from our national experience to promote participatory democracy and engage young people in the democratic process. Finally, framed around the concept of fáilte and reflecting the transformation our society has undergone since Ireland last held the presidency in 2000, we will work to foster a Europe of welcome, inclusion, and diversity. Across our 6-month term, we'll chair more than a dozen meetings of the Committee of Ministers and convene 24 conferences, seminars, and events across Strasbourg and Ireland. We will look to enhance European standards on combating domestic sexual and gender-based violence. We'll seek to chart a path to better reinforce the ECHR in so-called grey zones. We will reflect on new challenges to the association and consider how collectively we can reinforce societal commitment to human rights through global education. Civil society is at the core of the Council of Europe. And as civil society leaders, your contribution will be vital to our presidency, the programme for which we'll publish in a few weeks' time. In conclusion, we can never afford to take civil society freedoms for granted. The contribution of the participants as well as the panelists at today's event is greatly appreciated, and I wish you very fruitful discussions. Thank you very much, and thank you for your continuing work.
And our sincere thanks to Minister Coveney for those remarks. And I think at the end there, concluding on the importance of civil society and Europe, it's very appropriate now to hand over to and introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, all the way from India. So we're very grateful that he's been able to make time available to join us physically, the EU Special Representative on Human Rights, Mr. Eamon Gilmore. Eamon, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Minister, Ambassadors Geraldine Byrne-Nason and Michael Gaffey, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I want to join the Minister in expressing my own personal sadness at the recent passing of James Kingston and Jim Kelly, both of whom I had the honour of working with when I was Minister. And in the case indeed of James Kingston, continue to have that honour in my current capacity. It is a great privilege to be asked to address this forum, and I want to congratulate the Department of Foreign Affairs on marking the 20th year of this important and vital forum for discussion with civil society. As you mentioned, Jerry, I'm joining you from India, where I'm attending the Raisina Dialogue, which is India's main high-level conference on geopolitics. And I'm also, while here, meeting with local civil society, with human rights defenders, and with government officials. Country visits like this are a regular part of my work, and indeed over the past number of months I've been in Pakistan, I was on the Ukraine border in Poland, in the United States, Uganda, Egypt. And through that work, and indeed through the work that I have been doing over the past 3 years as the EU Special Representative for Human Rights, and reflecting on the global human rights environment as this conference is about, I think it is fair to say that we are experiencing at present a worldwide recession on human rights and democracy. That, of course, itself is not news, because it had been evident somewhat even before the COVID-19 pandemic. There were negative signs already manifesting around the world. Gender had become a source of fierce argument. The rights of women and girls were already being called into question. Journalists were being censored by many governments, and disinformation openly spread by many of the same governments. Civil society space was being squeezed and in many cases shut down, and human rights defenders were being attacked and undermined. And even the very basic concepts of human rights were being called into question by some. The huge destabilization generated by the pandemic, of course, made that worse, and I'm thinking in particular of issues like domestic violence. But I think the pandemic also brought with it new opportunities in a way, an opportunity to build a fairer, greener, better society underpinned by human rights and democracy. But unfortunately, it also gave the opportunity to those who want to increase repressive measures, to weaken democratic checks and balances, and to dilute the rule of law. Over the past 2 years, report after report have documented and demonstrated the recession in democracy worldwide. For example, the latest report from the VDEM Institute, according to that report, the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 2021 is now down to the levels that it was in 1989 before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Over 60% of the world's population now live in autocracies, either of the absolute kind or of the electoral kind. Worldwide, we're seeing the highest number of violent conflicts since the Second World War. According to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, 1/4 of humanity now live in conflict-affected countries. That's 2 billion people. Last year, 84 million people were forcibly displaced because of conflict, violence, and human rights violations. And this year, the UN estimates that 274 million people will need humanitarian assistance. The numbers of people being displaced into the EU itself is now at the highest since the Second World War. Force and firepower are once again being seen by some as legitimate means of achieving geopolitical goals, and nuclear arsenals are once again growing and are being threatened to be used. 6 months ago, I was visiting a free, democratic, and relatively peaceful Ukraine. I stood at the contact line with the non-government controlled eastern part. I talked with OSCE monitors, with victims from the earlier conflict, with journalists who told me of the torture of detainees in Crimea. I spoke with ministers, parliamentarians, civil society, human rights defenders, and none of us could have imagined then the hell that is now being inflicted on the Ukrainian people by the full-scale invasion of their country by Russia, and by the manner of that aggression, including the violations of international humanitarian law. It seems now that we barely get to grip with one crisis before another one erupts, further destabilizing the global human rights environment. Our attention is on Ukraine at this point in time, and rightly so. But we cannot forget about the people of Yemen, Syria, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Belarus, and Afghanistan. Over the past 2 years, we have been experiencing an avalanche of crises. I want to commend Ireland on the important leadership that it has shown at the UN Security Council on Human Rights, and in particular to acknowledge the work of Ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nason and Ambassador Michael Gaffey, both of whom are joining us today, particularly on a range of challenging situations and crises, such as Ukraine, Ethiopia, and the Middle East, and climate change, ensuring that the most vulnerable have a voice and are not forgotten. And everywhere I go, I am proud to point to Ireland's active and principled role on the Security Council. Ireland is, of course, a key part of the great European peace project. The European Union itself was founded on the values of human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. We believe in the right of everyone to live in dignity, free from fear and want, to voice their views and to participate in the decisions affecting them. We believe in peace and in development that is sustainable, participative, and inclusive. But these are not just European beliefs or values. They are universal, and every UN member has agreed to these principles in the UN Charter and in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. In the current challenging global human rights environment, the European Union has taken action in an attempt to reverse the democratic recession and to reinvigorate its work on human rights. Just last December, the EU launched the Global Europe Human Rights and Democracy Programme, This programme amounts to €1.5 billion and replaces the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. It increases the EU supports for the promotion and protection of human rights, democracy and the rule of law, as well as for the work of civil society organisations and human rights defenders worldwide from the period 2021 to 2027. Under this programme, we also launched the new flagship initiative, the Team Europe Democracy, which will strengthen democracy around the world by promoting the rule of law, political and civil participation, media freedom and pluralism, and address the challenges and opportunities in digitalisation. 2021 also marked the first year of the implementation of the EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy for 2020 to 2024. Guiding the implementation of this plan is a central part of my work, and the 140 EU delegations and member states' embassies on the ground are bringing the plan to life and translating it from paper to action. The action plan is stepping up our work on long-standing priorities on human rights and democracies, but there are many new elements which respond to the challenges we currently face. It's not a one-size-fits-all plan. It's tailored for specific circumstances and needs at local level. And of course, civil society is a central and crucial partner in realising the goals of the action plan and making it a living document. 2021 also marked the first year of the EU Global Human Rights Sanctions regime. The EU Global Human Rights Sanctions regime is designed to target individuals, entities and bodies responsible for, involved in, or associated with serious human rights violations and abuses worldwide, no matter where they have occurred. Last year, the EU adopted restrictive measures targeting persons and entities from China, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Libya, South Sudan, Eritrea, and Russia. We increased support to civil society organisations and human rights defenders, especially environmental, land and indigenous peoples' rights defenders, women human rights defenders, and labour defenders. The EU Human Rights Defenders Mechanism, protectdefenders.eu, has supported nearly 53,000 human rights defenders at risk and their families since its launch in 2015. Supporting democratic electoral processes has remained a cornerstone in EU engagement worldwide. Despite the restrictions linked to the pandemic and political and security circumstances, in the second half of 2021, the EU successfully deployed election observation missions to Zambia, Kosovo, Iraq, Venezuela, Honduras, and the Gambia. I want to mention the recently published proposal for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, as I know that this will feature in the second half of your discussion, and I know that my friend and colleague, Ngos will tell you more about it during that discussion. This is an important development, as the directive would see companies required to identify, prevent, end, or mitigate the adverse impact of their activities on human rights, including child labour and the exploitation of workers. Combined with the important legislative initiatives also in the new Digital Services Act and the proposed Act on Artificial Intelligence, all of which are based on the human-centric and human rights-based approach, these are important new areas of activity on human rights, and I think demonstrating that the human rights agenda is broadening to include the whole area of business and human rights and human rights and the digital world. So while the global human rights environment may be facing challenges not seen in decades, these, I think, activities show that we can at least attempt to stop and reverse the recession that we are witnessing. It's not an insurmountable challenge. Complacency is not an option. The pandemic has shown us that human rights and democracy are not abstract or theoretical concepts, and indeed the virus itself demonstrated that universality is indeed very real. I think that awareness of rights is stronger and is growing. People around the world are becoming more indignant and determined, and civil society is central to that effort. All around the world, civil society continues to defend human rights and democracy, to increase awareness among communities about their rights and the reality around them, and to give voice to those who have not. But of course, we need to do more. And in particular, I think that if we are to prevail, we need to broaden the constituency for the human rights agenda. That means, I think, paying more attention to economic, social, and cultural rights, to making the language of human rights more accessible. And we must insist that human rights belong to people, not to any individual state or to any particular institution. And in the battle for human rights, which is a battle not only on the ground, but also a battle for the very concept and the soul of human rights, we need also, I believe, to look at new approaches and new ways of working. Next year, we will commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It will be a good moment for us to reflect on its seminal importance, but also to look at how we are working and how we can do more and do it better. We need more questioning, debate, discussion to focus our action, to increase our solidarity, to help those who are most vulnerable. When faced with brute force and tyranny, it can often be difficult to imagine a way forward, but I believe that human rights and democracy will prevail. They're not alien, but they are the lifeblood of humanity and of society. And I believe that the event that you are hosting today will contribute enormously to that discussion. I thank you for it, and I thank you for the opportunity of contributing to it.
Thank you so much, Eamon. That's both an excellent address and I think really comprehensive and really sets out the context for our two successive panel discussions as well, both the challenges at the UN level and internationally, and also some of the emerging challenges coming up in panel 2, whether that's going to be on human rights due diligence or some of the new developments in human rights related areas. So again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. We hope you will continue perhaps to watch with us for as long as you're available on your time. With that, I'm now happy to move to our first panel and to hand over to our Acting Political Director, Cote Moran. Cote has played an outstanding leadership role in the department as our Political Director in recent times and will shortly move, I would add, seamlessly to our UN team in New York. So she's very well placed to moderate this discussion as well. And while we're very much sorry to see her leave us here in Ivy House, we look forward to working with her in her new role. So Cote, perhaps without further ado, if I can hand over to you to introduce the first panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jerry, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody. It's great to see so many people online for this annual Civil Society Forum, and thanks for joining us. And huge thanks to our EU Special Representative on Human Rights, Eamon Gilmore, for a fantastic keynote address. I think Eamon has set out, as Jerry said, very well some of the challenges that we're facing, but also some of the opportunities and a challenge to us, I think, as collaborators in the space of human rights, as to how we might engage over the coming year. So this first panel, which I'm very pleased to moderate, is on the global human rights environment and for allowing us an opportunity to reflect on that a little bit. We want this session to be very interactive. We have Slido in use, and we would ask everybody to use that format to pose questions to our three fantastic panelists who have taken time out to join us today. We have three panelists, as I mentioned. We have our special rapporteur on the situation for human rights defenders, the UN Special Rapporteur, Mary Lawler. Mary, thanks so much for joining us today. Mary's brief is global, and she will be able to talk very globally about some of the challenges, both in her work and her reflections on the human rights environment as we see it now. Our other two panelists are my two great colleagues, Ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nathan, who's the permanent representative of Ireland to the UN in New York, and Ambassador Michael Gaffey, who's the permanent representative to the UN in Geneva. Both great colleagues, and I know that they will contribute from their own reflections of the last year that we have had. I think last year we, at the Civil Society Forum, we were looking, I suppose, forward in terms of Ireland's Security Council tenure. I don't think we realised the particular challenges that we would have ahead of us at that time, but I think we've seen, just with the scale of conflict and crisis that have unfolded over the last year and particularly the last number of months. Just what a challenge that has proven to be both globally and indeed for the multilateral system. And I think we're looking forward to hearing the perspective of our three panelists on that. It's a weighty topic, and I think we could speak for a long time on all of these issues. And I'm going to ask our panelists to respond to a couple of questions that we'll pose to them, and then we will open up space for taking questions from the Slido mechanism. We will have 90 minutes for this session, so plenty of time, and we hope that it can be as interactive and enjoyable as possible. So maybe if I could start, I suppose, with the unfolding crisis in Ukraine, which has really, I think, challenged all of us in terms of our response to that. And maybe to ask each of the panelists if they could just reflect a little bit on the war against Ukraine and how it has dominated global affairs since Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February. And maybe just if I could start with Ambassador Byrne-Nason in New York, and ask us to reflect a little bit, Geraldine, if you would, on how that has impacted on you, on your work, and Ireland's role on the Security Council over the last couple of months. Geraldine, over to you.
Thanks very much, Coach. Great to be online with so many friends, and particularly delighted to have heard Eamon Gilmore's keynote response there. Great to see you again, Eamon. Look, you've asked me to reflect on the impact of Ukraine on the Security Council. I'll be very direct. It has an enormous impact, and it's not a positive one. I mean, I think they're the two clear first statements I can make. Frankly, it's very difficult at the Security Council. We are faced with sitting beside the aggressor, the Russian Federation. That's the first challenge. And the second challenge is that the Russian Federation, as a permanent member of the Council, wields a veto to defend their role in the unjustifiable war, but secondly, a veto that prevents action by others at the Council, including Ireland, in terms of any steps we can take to move towards diplomacy or a dialogue. I must admit, it's a very frustrating and challenging time, hugely disruptive also to the overall agenda of the Council. Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine became the 23rd crisis situation on the agenda of the Council just 2 weeks ago. That means there are 22 other crises that we're also trying to deal with. And there's absolutely no doubt that at the table of the Security Council, despite best efforts, the situation in Ukraine has a spillover effect into the dynamic and the politics of the Council on just about every other item on our agenda. The second thing is that I think it's fair to say that the fact that you have Russia at the table using its veto in the context of Ukraine means that the credibility and the legitimacy of the Council is challenged in this particular context. And I won't go further than saying that. Of course, we could debate that. But as we've said many times at the Council, as Ireland, Russia's veto won't prevent the international community from responding to blatant breaches of international law, of international humanitarian and human rights law. And certainly, I think it's fair to say for Ireland, it won't prevent us standing for those principles that Eamon Gilmore referred to in his remarks, which has driven us in terms of our membership at the Council from the beginning. That means that we, despite the veto, despite the challenging disinformation that we hear almost every time we sit at the table on Ukraine, it means that Ireland is pushing, looking for opportunities to open pathways, whether that's on a humanitarian front or on a human rights front, allowing that the bigger picture on diplomacy and dialogue has to begin probably outside the Council. I will say that there's also a third effect here, which is that there is a tendency now to move some of the discussion on Ukraine to where it can actually get a result, which isn't now in the Security Council, but in the General Assembly. Clearly, in the General Assembly, you have 193 countries, but no one country wields a veto. So we have seen just over 3 weeks ago where 141 of those 193, that's a pretty remarkable number, voted in favor of a resolution that basically demanded that Russia, and I'll quote, immediately, completely, unconditionally withdraw all of its forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. So the action there in the Council was unequivocal and clear. Yesterday, historical day at the General Assembly, something Ireland has worked on for many years now with other small states. And I want to emphasize that point in terms of the capacity of small states like Ireland. Yesterday, like Liechtenstein, who led an initiative in the General Assembly that basically says in a nutshell, if a permanent member uses a veto in the Security Council, they are automatically called to defend or account, is the term we should use, account for their veto in the General Assembly. So transparency and accountability, that means as of yesterday, the next time Russia or any other permanent member wields a veto, they will be called to heel in the General Assembly to explain why they have taken that move. It doesn't stop the use of the veto, but it's a significant step forward. So I think that that's an important, in the context of Ukraine, but also in the context, for example, of what happened to Ireland in December when we put a resolution on the table on climate and security. What do you know? Vetoed by the Russian Federation. We didn't have that opportunity to have them explain their case. Now that situation has been addressed. And then just to sort of two last points, if I may, just to remind us all, I guess, that the decision to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council was actually taken here at the General Assembly in New York. A contested decision. You know, many of us had questions about keeping people out of a discussion rather than insisting they stay in. But the overwhelming message from the General Assembly that it's unacceptable for a member to continue sitting in the Council while reportedly committing gross systematic violations of human rights. And there is a sense that Russia is making a mockery of its situation, both here on the Security Council, but at the Human Rights Council also, as it perpetrates such crimes in Ukraine. We have taken concrete steps here. Just last week, Minister Simon Coveney in New York focused post his visit in Ukraine on the gendered impacts of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, with reports of sexual violence by Russian soldiers. We met with the Secretary General's Special Representative on conflict-related sexual violence just as she left New York to go to Ukraine. She's there as we speak today. So she will link in with the excellent work of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Team, the Ukrainian Prosecutor General. We will meet here this week with Karim Khan of the ICC, who's also been in Bucha and, of course, in other parts of Ukraine. So that accountability issue is really to the forefront of our mind here. I'll finish off by saying, no matter what veto is wielded and no matter what disinformation we hear at the table of the Security Council, Russia bears responsibility for the crisis, but I would argue we bear a collective responsibility to keep trying at the Security Council to keep the door open for a pathway to dialogue and diplomacy. You saw the Secretary General yesterday in Moscow. He's in Kiev today. He's talking also to Turkey, who've been playing a backroom role. He's talking to neighbourhood countries. The UN has a role to play. The Security Council has to keep focused on this, and we do that. We will do that later today in a discussion on accountability as well. We're resolute, very challenging, but not giving up hope. And going back to the point Eamon Gilmore made, this has to be a principled, clear-eyed position that we adopt. And I like to think that's what we're doing, Cote.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. Thanks very much. I think you've given us a very clear perspective on some of the challenges for the Security Council and maybe some of the innovative approaches that UN member states have taken to stress and underline that the importance of accountability, not just on Ukraine, but more broadly. I'd like to turn over now to Ambassador Michael Gaffey in Geneva. And Michael, if you could share some reflections with us from the perspective in Geneva of the Ukraine war with us. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Coach, and hello to everybody. And I want to say, first of all, especially thanks to Eamon Gilmore for setting the scene so clearly. in advance and setting the context in terms of human rights, because before Ukraine, the situation, the challenges on human rights were massive and building in any case, on gender, as he said, on civil society space and across the thematic areas. And it emphasizes really, as he did, the critical role that civil society needs to continue to play despite these challenges, and the critical need for us, especially as a champion of civil society, to support them. Ukraine, needless to say, look, echoing everything that Geraldine said, since the 24th of February, it has dominated everything in the work here in Geneva. Now, this is good and it is bad. I mean, it's very good that such a fundamental breach of human rights and of the Charter should be addressed, but it also diverts us, possibly, there's a danger of diverting us from other challenges. It has had one effect that might not have been expected, which is it has united the European Union. People thought that that was a difficult thing to do in the Human Rights Council or in this world, but it has, and I don't think Russia expected that. And the EU has been playing a very strong role along with Ukraine at the Human Rights Council. And I just mentioned three things. One, the invasion coincided with the opening of the main session of the Human Rights Council, and therefore it dominated this. It dominated our Minister Coveney's statement. In fact, it was the only issue he addressed in the statement. We were then very careful afterwards to ensure that we addressed other issues throughout the session. But there was an urgent debate and the appointment of a commission of inquiry. The Human Rights Council at least can act to that extent and has appointed a commission of inquiry into human rights abuses in Ukraine. And that has happened already. The three members have already been appointed and are starting their work, linking up with civil society and linking up with the investigative mechanism in Belarus, which is very important. And the work will continue. The Office of the High Commissioner, they have been doing strong monitoring work, and Michelle Bachelet issued a very strong statement, and there will be follow-up last week. So that is continuing. Secondly, Geraldine mentioned, of course, the expulsion of Russia, the suspension of Russia from the Human Rights Council. There was a really strong feeling here in Geneva, certainly among the Europeans and Western, that it was an affront to listen to Russia in the Human Rights Council speaking the way it did. But we also recognize the challenges in terms of diplomacy. The Human Rights Council is a subsidiary body of the General Assembly, so the vote was necessary in New York to do so. Now, just to explain briefly, suspending Russia from a country from the membership of the Human Rights Council meant suspending them from their functions in the council. They remain as a member, but are unable to speak, to vote, or to do anything that a member can do. So Russia, who are masters of procedure, immediately announced their withdrawal from membership of the Human Rights Council. And legally, that now makes them an observer member of the Human Rights Council, the same as we are, which means they can still speak for slightly shorter time. They can do most things you can do as a member, but they cannot vote. And frankly, personally, I think this probably is the best outcome, because I'm not sure that silencing Russia like that would necessarily be what we needed. To turn the aggressor into the victim does not help. And I think, as Geraldine says, we need to keep open some avenues for dialogue and for resolution of this conflict, at the same time making it absolutely clear that the continued membership of the council, against the background of what has been happening, was an affront. And that, thirdly, I'll just say, that leads us to another area where we need to guard, I think, now against a perceived Eurocentrism. And it is something that we are seeing in our relations with our other partners in Africa and elsewhere. Not that they are opposed, but that they are starting to suggest that maybe we are only focused on our own region. Recognizing the fundamental and massive nature of what has happened in Ukraine, I think it's a lesson to us that we also need to remain open to our partners and their problems. This is not the first conflict that has happened in the world. It is not the first set of massacres and human rights abuses. And so I think there's a real awareness here that we as Europeans need to be more open to the concerns of our African partners, for instance, who are coming under heavy pressure from Russia and indeed from China also. So that is one of the big lessons, and something that we will need to take into account in the coming weeks and months here. And very finally, I would just say it really does raise the issue of accountability in a big way. One of the good things about the Human Rights Council is that it's possible to take action in terms of investigative mechanisms, but I think everyone would agree that we have a long way to go in terms of accountability, that the people of Europe are seeing what is happening every day on their screens in Ukraine, but similar appalling abuses and violations are also happening in other parts of the world. And I think we really do need to address more effectively. We know the challenges, but look more systematically at issues, the issue of accountability, which is, after all, as Geraldine says, one of the priorities of our time on the Security Council. But it's also a massive priority for Ireland in terms of foreign policy and human rights. And I just say finally that we're meeting today in the shadow of the memorial service of our very good colleague James Kingston, and I was able to watch that earlier today, and it really struck me that James personally did a huge amount of work on the issue of the criminal court and on the issue of accountability. So I think we'll take some inspiration from his work there too. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks for those reflections, and thanks also for mentioning James Kingston and as mentioned also by Eamon Gilmore and Minister Cote and Jim Kelly, who we have lost very tragically in the last number of weeks. Both James and Jim were huge proponents of international law, in particular of international human rights law, and they are huge loss to not just our department but to the state. And they both valued enormously the role that civil society plays. And they are a massive, massive loss. But as Michael says, I think we take inspiration from both of their memories and the values and the principles that they showed in their work with us, and we bring that forward with us. We're joined by members of the Diplomatic Corps online. We're joined by civil society and by colleagues in academia. And I would encourage all of those colleagues online, if you have questions, please put those questions into Slido. If you feel comfortable, please put your name in and the name of the organisation that you represent, and we'll come to those questions after we go through some questions with the panellists. It's a pleasure now to turn to Mary Lawler, Mary, who's Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. And Mary, you might just, again, focusing on the topic of Ukraine, could you just reflect a little bit on I suppose, your perspective on how that's affected specifically human rights defenders, and anything you might like to share with us more broadly on the situation in Ukraine. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you very much for having me here today for what I think is a very interesting agenda. So thanks to the Human Rights Unit and to you, Cote, and to Jerry and everyone involved and my fellow panelists. At the outset, I also want to pay tribute to James Kingston on the day of his funeral for his unwavering respect for human rights defenders, for human rights and the rule of law. When I started Frontline in 2001, James came to me and offered to volunteer. And I was a bit scared at the time, so it was great to have his wise advice and his input into those early days. So I like to remember him today, and I was very moved by the funeral this morning. So now to Ukraine. I've obviously been following the situation in Ukraine facing human rights defenders and also the situation in Russia, both through the online meetings that I've been having and hearing from them how the war has impacted on their work and on their security. And it's often in crisis situations that the work of human rights defenders is thrown into relief, highlighting the crucial and life-saving nature of the work that they do. It's also struck me how vital it is that human rights defender networks were established and are established and in place before a crisis hits, that links with the international community have already been made. And I've spoken to many organizations who also talk about the need for resources. From Ukrainian defenders I've spoken to, I've heard how many have chosen to remain in the country and how they have shifted their work from human rights defense work, for instance, to monitoring violations, from monitoring violations to providing humanitarian assistance to the sick and the elderly. Where men are being mobilized to fight, the work of women human rights defenders takes on all the more importance. One woman in particular, who was trained as a nurse originally, comes to mind, and she drew on this training to spend 12 hours from 8 in the morning to 8 at night, still does it, driving around, delivering water, food and medication, and providing medical support to the elderly, the displaced, the disabled, and those who have cancer, for whom leaving their houses is impossible. Another LGBTI defender last week was unloading humanitarian aid for women and children in Lib when a man called to her, and she turned to him and he sprayed chemicals in her face. She has suffered injuries to the face, including her eyes and hands. Others I have spoken to have been collecting evidence of war crimes or helping people leave the country, and some have changed their websites to provide practical information to civilians. At the same time, I've also been watching with dismay what's happening in Russia, as the Russian authorities have moved to complete their stranglehold over civil society to limit any domestic opposition to the war. Multiple NGOs and media houses have been shut down, accused of being foreign agents, while thousands of human rights defenders and protesters have been detained for voicing their abhorrence at the war. A number of criminal cases have been opened under the fake news law, which was adopted last month, and at least one woman has been jailed for 2 years. Those human rights defenders who have not been arrested have been beaten, intimidated, and defamed. Some have had the letter Z spray painted onto their doors, while a pig's head was left at the home of the director of an independent media platform. Last week in The Hague, I spoke to 2 Russian human rights defenders who have fled in the last 2 months. One of them, a lawyer, told me that he felt a moral obligation to leave the country because as long as he practiced law in Russia, he believed he was contributing to the government's fiction that there existed the rule of law. We have sadly seen that this has unambiguously become the rule by law. Another woman human rights defender said that after 25 years working for women's rights, she felt defeated. Lastly, on this, I think it's important to highlight how human rights defenders and NGOs have been left high and dry in many instances in Russia following the withdrawal of the services of tech companies. NGO websites which had been hosted by foreign companies have been taken offline, while many human rights defenders have also been left without VPNs to secure their communications following companies' decisions to suspend their services. I really believe it's very important, more now than ever, to support and crucially sustain the work of those human rights defenders who remain in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. First of all, for bearing witness and sharing those very personal stories about the impact on human rights defenders. And thank you also for your very kind words about our colleague and friend, James Kingston, which we really deeply appreciate, particularly on a day like today. So thank you very much for that. I think you set out in a very individual way the impact that this war by Russia against Ukraine has had on the situation on human rights and those defending human rights, Mary. And thank you very much for that. I know that we will come back to some of these issues in questions afterwards, but I wanted to move to more global situations. Michael had mentioned just, I suppose, the importance of retaining a focus on other situations which are of huge concern, while we, of course, maintain our focus on Ukraine at the same time. And so I'd like to ask each of the panelists if they could reflect a little on other crises that they have been engaged with over the last year and perspectives that you might like to share. If you'd like to particularly take one crisis that you've been engaged with in your work, and maybe talk to us a little bit about that and some of the challenges there and your work on those situations. And maybe Michael, I might go back to you first on that, if that's okay, before going back to Geraldine and to Mary. Thanks very much, Michael.
Thanks very much, Cote. Well, I think it has been an unfortunately busy year, because we are facing as a crisis after crisis, and they were in the context as well of the ongoing impact of the pandemic, and especially its massive impact on inequalities, and all of that in the broader existential context of climate change. So it's not an easy agenda. And I could pick out quite a few, but I won't. I'll just mention two in particular. One, Ethiopia, where Ireland, as Geraldine will probably mention, has been particularly active on the Security Council, and I think that's an area where our Geneva and New York were able to work extremely closely and hand in hand on making a difference in terms of the conflict and the massive human rights abuses and the sexual, gender-based and sexual conflict violence. And I would say that here we were in very, very close contact throughout with the High Commissioner and her office. And I would say that I would pay tribute to High Commissioner Bachelet's initiative, when there was no resolution initially from the Human Rights Council, in establishing the joint investigation with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. It was a little bit controversial to do so, but it has given us at least some very, very clear evidence of massive human rights abuses in Tigray, and especially the horrendous sexual violence aspect of it. And that has been followed up then in last December by, again, the EU uniting, which is always a difficult task, uniting to call for a special session on Ethiopia, and the appointment of an international commission of human rights experts, which has been established and which is headed by the former ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda. And they will have a difficult job, but at least we now have a mandated independent mechanism to investigate human rights abuses. It has of course been difficult in terms of relations with Ethiopia and with some African colleagues, but it also has emphasized the need for us to work in partnership as much as possible with our partners in Africa. And the other huge crisis that emerged just in advance of the September session of the Human Rights Council, which was also a massive issue for Ireland on the Security Council, was Afghanistan. And again, the EU led on that here in Geneva. And we ended up with a resolution to appoint a special rapporteur on Afghanistan. And it involved quite a lot of debate within the EU on whether we had time to act, and a conclusion that we had no option but to act. So these crises have, in a way, given the EU an opportunity which it has taken to lead in a way that it may not have done so before. Many other items have come up, but one other one I would mention, which has been a bit controversial, but I think it's important to mention it, is the establishment last May of an open-ended commission of inquiry on the occupied territories, Israel and the occupied territories. And we've got into the pattern of a series of special sessions of the Human Rights Council every time there is an outbreak of violence in Gaza or in the West Bank. And the EU did not necessarily support this open-ended commission of inquiry, but we certainly, Ireland supported the holding of the session, and we have been acting in supporting the commission of inquiry now that has been established. So that has now been established as an open-ended permanent commission of inquiry, which, needless to say, is not supported by a range of countries, but I think it will have an impact, and it is notably, it is chaired by the former High Commissioner Navi Pillay. So I just mention it because I think we will be hearing more from that commission. So I just mentioned those for now, and there are other areas that I will mention later, especially Yemen.
Thanks very much, Michael. Thanks for that, and then really a very strong focus then on accountability in relation to those crises and what's happening in Geneva. Geraldine, if I could turn to you in New York. An extremely busy 6 month year, dealing with multiple crises at the same time and interacting with those. Would you like to speak about one or two of those situations?
Thanks, Cote. And as always, Michael has made my job very easy. But if I may just pick up on one general point Michael made earlier, which really concerns us here, and that is the risk that the perception is that Ukraine is crowding out other crises. And when I said it became the 23rd crisis, you know, there are raging crises across on the Security Council, across all of the other areas. And there's certainly a vigilance, if not to say, I would say, a sort of a political anxiety in the global south, that Ukraine is not just sucking the energy out of the political debate, but is also there are resource implications and attention focused deficits risked for the other crises. And that's something that we are hugely sensitive to here as Ireland on the Security Council, and working very hard to make clear that that's not the case. Now, Michael highlighted two of the areas that I think are really critical to what we're doing here on the Council. The first is the conflict in Ethiopia. You know, we have had a very bumpy road in the last year in terms of the conflict, you know, high points where it looked like TPLF were on the road almost coming into Addis at some stage. And then, of course, Prime Minister Abiy has taken steps to calm things down. The situation on the humanitarian front, which has been a constant focus for Ireland, has improved somewhat. But the reality is that although there are some hopeful signs of a humanitarian ceasefire in recent months, there's a desperate food insecurity in Tigray in particular, but also now right across Ethiopia. So we're facing potentially famine-like conditions in several parts of Ethiopia. And the human rights situation remains very much of concern for us in what is fundamentally still a situation of instability. Sexual violence has defined, almost been a trademark of the crisis particularly in the Tigray area, with reports of rape and systematic use of sexual violence by all sides involved. And the reports have been horrific. Again, something we have been working very closely with the Secretary General's representative on conflict-related sexual violence to address. And as Michael pointed out, there's work underway out of Geneva on that. So just as Ethiopia and the Ethiopian government tried to rebuild peace and hopefully get dialogue underway, accountability from our point of view, working here on the Council, will also be extraordinarily important. We will continue to shine a light on the humanitarian needs in Ethiopia. Just yesterday, a second area of ongoing chronic crisis, of course, is the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel. We had a meeting on that situation just yesterday. We got updates on what has been very sort of a series of flashpoints in the last few weeks, with violence, extremism, deaths of civilians on both sides, compounded really, as we see it, by the illegal Israeli settlements, which we see as pulling the region further and further away from peace. We haven't seen any spectacular breakthroughs in terms of our efforts to address the situation in the Middle East during our time, not for want of effort by Ireland at the Security Council, both at the table and the minister's own engagement in the region on the ground. But it's something that we continue to highlight. And while yesterday the message from Tor Venesland, the special representative, the special envoy, the Secretary General, was the situation was relatively calm, we're highly vigilant. It's just a year ago exactly that we had horrendous scenes in Gaza, and frankly faced major challenges as Ireland at the Security Council in ensuring open public debate on the issue. So our antennae are up. We're working very closely with other like-minded colleagues. I'm glad we had an open discussion on this week, but I seriously regret that the Security Council hasn't been able to speak with one voice, even to call for calm on the ground. And that's an issue that, you know, we will have to come back to. Michael highlighted Afghanistan, mentioned Afghanistan, the situation of human rights in Afghanistan, as we watch the situation at the Council, deeply, deeply worrying. On the upside at the Security Council, despite all that's going on around Ukraine, we managed to get agreement on a mandate for the UN on the ground in Afghanistan. But of course, a mandate doesn't solve a crisis situation. And we're now seeing, particularly in relation to women and girls, rights to education not being realized, targeted attacks by the Taliban against journalists, particularly against women human rights defenders. I know Mary has spoken about that. Civil society actors being targeted directly. We're very, very concerned right now in relation to the Hazara community, where we're seeing a renewed effort to attack them. I spoke just last week to a group of Afghan women we stay in touch with here, and they had really quite harrowing tales to tell in terms of the targeting of the Hazaras. So just to say that's a crisis situation that we don't for a minute take our eye away from. In that case, we are dealing with big regional actors who would prefer that we don't look at what's happening on the ground and that we accept a so-called relative calm, not something Ireland is about to do at the Security Council. I haven't mentioned in all of that the situation in Myanmar continues equally to be one where human rights abuse allegations are legion. We're having difficulty with access in Myanmar. We're having clearly difficulty in getting even the UN Special Representative into conversations on the ground in Myanmar. The ASEAN Special Envoy, who has a really critical role to play, hasn't yet had that important visit where they engage with senior members of the Tatmadaw. So, a situation we don't take our eye off. And I'll just, as we go, mention two others, if I may, Coach. One is Sudan. Today, as I leave this conversation, we will discuss the incredibly horrendous attacks in the last few days in Sudan. 200 people dead at least, civilians due to terrorist attacks, and an increased instability in Darfur and more generally in Sudan. And also just didn't want not to mention a situation that I wouldn't say we're describing as crisis, but is definitely very much on the horizon, close to home, and that's Libya. A failed effort, disappointing in December that we didn't get to see the Libyan people vote to have their own democratically elected government. Now a situation of some tension with foreign fighters still in the area, civilian unease, and competing to arms of government or aspiring prime ministers. Some signs of hope from discussions in Cairo, but we need really to watch this very carefully because it has the capacity to be a conflagration very quickly. So we're very concerned and working hard to avoid that. So that's just a hop, skip and jump through some of the crises that we're dealing with.
Geraldine, thank you very much. And I think from both your and Michael's interventions there, we just see the number of crises that are currently facing us. And as you both said, that's a snapshot. There are more, and there are extremely complex challenges underneath that. And the crisis in Ukraine has certainly made that even more complicated, including in terms of impacts on global food security, but also in terms of regional dynamics on particular conflicts as well, which I think we're all very conscious of. Mary, could I turn the same question over to you, please? Just if you could reflect a little bit on, particularly with the situation in relation to human rights defenders, as to the impact and where you would see the biggest challenges in terms of human rights defenders on the ground in particular situations.
Well, first of all, I want to say that obviously I don't disagree with anything that either Ambassador Byrne-Nason or Michael said, but I'll speak from the perspective of my mandate. So obviously I've invested a fair bit of time over the last 2 years on the situation of human rights defenders in Afghanistan, and particularly kept up after the fall of Kabul. And I've had numerous calls with women human rights defenders still in the country over the past 6 months, and they all ask the same thing. They all ask to get out. While some defenders have successfully sought international protection abroad since the takeover, most remain in the country. These defenders who've been crucial to building up the human rights movement in Afghanistan now find themselves facing destitution, forced into hiding, are unable to work, or to find any other work, any other employment to support themselves and their families, because they're known to the Taliban from their previous lives. Women human rights defenders, of course, are particularly repressed in this regard. And what's more, they are directly targeted and attacked in retaliation for their past work. Just 10 days ago, I spoke to 10 terrified women human rights defenders online who have all been attacked by the Taliban since the takeover. So I've been trying to amplify their voices at the international level and plead with governments to take some more human rights defenders. As I mentioned, I was in The Hague last week, where I met the Minister for Justice and Security to make the case for 6 high-risk human rights defenders, and I'll be in Berlin at the end of the month again, hoping to make a similar case. I've had some success with New Zealand, Germany and Spain, but to be honest, the international response faded very quickly when it came to helping human rights defenders from Afghanistan seek protection. But it does seem like an opportune time while we're on this call to suggest that Ireland could maybe take another 5 women human rights defenders that I'm personally in contact with and who are at very high risk because of their work. Some of them are being hunted by the Taliban as we speak because of their involvement in the protests, the recent protests in support of women's rights. And sadly, time is of the essence, because just 2 days ago on Monday, one of the women human rights defenders whose husband divorced her after the Taliban took over. She has 17-year-old twins, a boy and a girl, and we are just in the process of getting her out. But her ex-husband came and abducted the 17-year-old girl on Monday for forced marriage. More generally, on conflict and post-conflict situations, as the previous speakers have said, there's just so many of them. And I spend my life talking to human rights defenders, at least in Covet I did, and still do. And I've talked to them from Yemen, Syria, Sudan, Cameroon, Colombia, Myanmar, Belarus, Ethiopia, occupied territories, and of course Afghanistan and Ukraine over the months. And I really stress again the importance of including a human rights defender perspective in any discussion or negotiation on the situation, and particularly a women human rights defender perspective, given the profound additional challenge often faced by women defenders in conflict. Ideally, I would like to see human rights defenders mainstreamed into conflict response. This extends to inviting them to Security Council sessions, and I know Geraldine has said that there have been people from civil society going, albeit couched within the framework of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, in which they play such a vital role. I also remain hopeful that before the end of Ireland's membership of the Security Council, I'll have the opportunity to raise some of these issues at an area formula meeting on defenders or women in conflict. With a government such as Ireland, which is very supportive on the issue of human rights defenders on the Security Council, we should try and kickstart some of the human rights defender mainstreaming.
Thanks so much, Mary, and we're taking a good note here of that request in terms of Afghan female human rights defenders. I think we will move on, maybe just to ask if we could ask maybe Geraldine first. Just we've talked a lot about some of the challenges on the council over the last 15 months. I suppose just to try and bring up the discussion a little bit, is there any high points, Geraldine, that you'd like to mention? We've mentioned some of the more difficult and challenging issues, but maybe if you wanted to mention some of the progress that has been made on the council, as well, in particular reflecting the discussion in terms of civil society and the engagement of civil society as well.
Thanks, Coach. It's not often I'm asked for high points. People tend to ask me more about the low points, so happy to discuss that. Of course, although despite the introduction we've given and, the sense of frustration at times about the way in which the Council is stymied in terms of our national ambition to see it active and delivering. I have to say a big high point for us was the moment back in September when Ireland actually was in the presidency of the Security Council. So when we had a direct capacity to influence, importantly, in my view, not just what the Council did, but who the Council was listening to and who the Council heard from. And there was, tremendous excitement here in the team in New York, because we were able to open the door at the Security Council to prioritize engagement with civil society. I just, in a parenthesis, would like to say that here in New York, we've seen tremendous obstacles for civil society engagement because of COVID. Just practical issues about access have translated themselves, in my view, into a sort of a narrowing of the channel for hearing from civil society. So we decided in September that we would do our utmost to open that up. And we actually invited the highest number ever. It's still a standing record at the Security Council for women civil society briefers. So we had, I think it was 16 women civil society briefers who came in right across all of the crisis areas that we addressed during our presidency. And we were able to give them literally, put them in the room and at the table to discuss the issues that are most impacting on them. So we had women from Syria to Yemen to Afghanistan speaking to us on the issues that matter. And we had a number in that group of human rights defenders, as we would classically identify them here. So we were immensely proud to have given an opportunity for such wide participation. We have also, a little bit behind the scenes, but I think in a very influential way, ensured the voices of particularly women, but also other human rights and civil society actors come into the work of the expert groups at the Council. I'll give you one practical example, which is the group that we chair on women, peace and security, where we have ensured that in some cases victims, but in other cases agents and actors in building women's roles in peace and security have come into the expert level discussions. We did that on Afghanistan while the special representative of the Secretary General was at the table for 4 or 5 hours, listening, hearing directly from civil society in a way that just doesn't happen often at the Council. We've also done it in relation to the Middle East, and we'll certainly continue to do that in relation to other crisis areas. So for me, high points are the ones where you get to open the door, ensure the right people are at the table and the voices are heard. And if I'm allowed one low point, a moment I will never forget, and that is the night that Russia invaded Ukraine. We were actually sitting at the Security Council table, frankly summoning up all of the powerful arguments against any attack on Ukraine, and certainly any unjustified illegal invasion. And it happened in front of us. And not only was the Secretary General completely shocked by it, he was sitting, having made his plea. All of us, including, I believe, the Russian Federation delegation, were seeing this happen in real time on their telephones as the media picked up on the news. And that for me was really, it was a big insult to the Security Council. It certainly was a pushback for multilateralism, that at the very moment we were all convening, trying to argue in favor of diplomacy, the most brutal action you can imagine was being rolled out. So it's a moment that I will never forget. As we said at the beginning, these are moments that we will come back from, and it doesn't in any way dim our determination, but these are sort of a high and a low point that I think I'll carry away when I eventually leave this role. Thanks very much, Coach.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. Michael, I'm going to ask you the same question. In terms of high points over the last year in Geneva, maybe a tougher question than the low points, but if there's anything that you'd want to reflect as an area of progress before talking about any particular low points you'd like to mention.
Well, I think I'll do the Irish approach and give you the low point first, and then you'll appreciate the high points all the more. Low point was undoubtedly the non-renewal of the mandate of the group of eminent experts in Yemen at the Human Rights Council last September. Ireland has been, from the start, a member of the core group pushing for that, which led to the establishment of that investigative mechanism in 2017. And we did so with the Netherlands, with Belgium and Luxembourg, and with Canada. Not a cross-regional group, you will note, and we do prefer usually to work in cross-regional groups, and I think there are lessons there. But I won't go into the background, the details of it, but there is now a major accountability gap there in Yemen. And I hope that actually we can be part of action to get a different, a new investigative mechanism put in there. I think what could be helpful and what should be helpful is the attitude of the United States, which seems to be firmly convinced that there is a need there that needs to be addressed. But that undoubtedly, on top of everything else, was a low point. High points, I would just mention very quickly the resolution, the consensual adoption of our resolution, Ireland's resolution on civil society space in June 2021, and I know there'll be some questions more on that. I think that was important, especially given the impact of COVID on civil society space and on civil society. Another was the move, which we were very supportive of, by Marshall Islands to establish a special rapporteur on climate change, on the human rights aspects of climate change, and that has been that was successful, and it was very much, again, the EU was able to take a strong part in support of another country rather than doing it themselves. And the other high point I would say is not over the past year; it's over I've been here now for 4.5 years, and in that time, what has been a huge, not a series of high points, but also of enormous benefit to the human rights system, and frankly to Ireland, is the strengthening of special procedures by the the successful appointment of so many Irish experts. And I think when I came here, and it's nothing to do with me, when I came here, Fionnuala Ní Éileann had just been appointed. We had one special rapporteur. Now there are, and these are independent, as we know, but now there are 5 special rapporteurs who are also Irish and who bring that expertise to bear. Fionnuala Ní Éileann, Mary Lawler, my fellow panelist here on human rights defenders, Siobhan Mullally on human trafficking, Gerard Quinn on disability, and Anita Ramasastry on the working group on business and human rights, who also did fantastic work as chair of the Special Procedures Coordination Committee. I think that has really been important for the human rights system, but it's also been important for Ireland, and I just want to pay tribute to all of those 5, 4 women and 1 man, especially Mary, who's on the panel. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Michael. And we will turn to Mary now. And Mary, I wanted to just ask you a little bit about the impact of COVID on the work of special rapporteurs. I mean, part of your work very much is about traveling to areas to see for yourself on the ground and to report back. It's been a really challenging time in that work since the pandemic. Hopefully it's a little bit more possible now to travel. And so if I could ask you just to talk a little bit about that, the impact of COVID on the work of special rapporteurs, and how you see the special rapporteurs collaborating together, but also hopefully in a COVID recovery period, trying to get back out into the field. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, Michael. To be honest now, we all know that I wouldn't be in this job if the mission hadn't lobbied so successfully for me, so thank you for that. Turning to your question and about COVID, when the pandemic altered obviously all our work, and particularly the work of special rapporteurs, but I don't think it impeded it. I actually think for my mandate, one of the unintended consequences of the pandemic that really assisted the work was being able to speak online and the normalization of online meetings. Like since I've started, I've spoken to over 14,000 human rights defenders in small and large groups over the course of the 2 years. And they represent a huge range of issues and a diversity of identities. And they're in every corner of the world, you know, from very remote areas, and this for me is the added value in the online meetings. You can meet people in remote areas, which wouldn't have been possible if the work had just continued the way it had always going on, because usually all the meetings take place in the capitals and there isn't time to go further, and a lot of defenders aren't connected anyway. So I've managed to make contact with people who'd never been in contact either regionally or internationally or with the UN system. So that has expanded the network. And I've also, because of the online meeting, I've also been able to invite other rapporteurs. If we're having, say, a meeting on Somalia, I invited the special rapporteur on Somalia who came to it. You know, if we had a meeting on human rights defenders with disabilities the other day, and one of Jared's team was there. So it's about trying to expand. And I met a Cuban human rights defender, and I've just put her in touch with the rapporteur on culture and freedom of association and assembly and freedom of expression. So that's a really plus for the online possibilities of meeting with human rights defenders from all over the world in very remote context. Now, having said that, of course, human-to-human contact is really important, and I'm delighted that we're starting the country visits again, and my first one will be to Greece, because I'm particularly interested in the situation facing the defenders of migrants and refugee rights and the creeping criminalization of solidarity that we're seeing throughout the world. I've heard from human rights defenders in Greece who are facing harassment, intimidation, and crazy charges such as espionage and money laundering. And not to mention the aiding and abetting of illegal entry for offering safety, food, and water and shelter to migrants and refugees. And of course, many here today will be familiar with the case of Sean Binder, who grew up in Ireland, and he's facing charges of money laundering, espionage, and assisting illegal smuggling for his humanitarian work, and he faces up to 25 years in prison for his role in search and rescue operations. And then in November, I'm going to Tajikistan for my second country visit, and in February of next year, I'm going to Cameroon. I did an analysis last year of the countries which had received limited attention despite the grave situation for defenders from previous mandate holders. And these are two of a handful which I've chosen to focus a bit more on in the year. And I think the ongoing conflict in Cameroon is underrepresented and underreported phenomenon. And I'm hoping to just try and bring more attention. And can I say something about two positives? Because I always like to finish on a positive note. For me, two things that come to mind: the implementation of the human rights defender law in Cote d'Ivoire, which was just a couple of weeks ago, which is great news. The setting up of a human rights defender contact group among the states in Geneva, who have agreed to take 2 actions which we'll supply every month. And then the little small victories. I always like a small victory because it keeps you going for want of any other reason. But for example, there was a human rights defender. I'll just give one example. One in China, and this poor man defender who'd been there for 12 years, who wasn't allowed to have any visits, and who wasn't allowed to see a lawyer or his parents, and he was in a cell with no light and all of that. And after representation, and I do realize that all positive change is a collective effort, but after representation, after I spoke to the Chinese mission, he's now been moved to a cell where he has television and light, and he's allowed to see his mother. So when you're serving 12 years, it's a small victory for me because he hasn't been released, but it's a big victory for him. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mary, and that's a very positive point to make in terms of an individual positive story, not the entire outcome we would want, but certainly an improvement in a particular situation, which is incredibly important. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to move to some of the questions. We have plenty of questions, and thanks for all of those questions on Slido. I will begin to ask some of those. We'll try to get to as many as possible as we have in the time available. The first question I'm going to ask is from David Joyce from the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. Thanks, David, for the question. And David says, in light of growing evidence of sexual violence in the Ukraine war, what can be done to make sure that women refugees have access to sexual and reproductive health care? So thanks, David, for that question. Obviously, this is an issue in terms of the impact of women of this crisis in Ukraine. It's an enormous issue and one we could spend a huge amount of time on. But I might, if I could, go to Geraldine on this question and just ask for some comments and some perspectives on that particular issue. Geraldine, thank you.
Thanks, Cote, and thanks, David, for the question. I'll tell you that I raised this issue early on in our discussions, and the Security Council was quite clear the Russian Federation is hugely sensitive on this point. So that's just a political point I leave with a full stop there. First thing to say to you is that, of course, we all know that sexual violence and conflict can amount to a war crime. And so, you know, the gathering of evidence, having the hard facts are absolutely essential to ensure that we will ultimately, in the short to medium term, hopefully be able to follow through in accountability for the crimes. I mentioned at the top that we have the UN Human Rights Commission monitoring team on the ground. The Ukrainian prosecutor with whom Minister Coveney met when he was on his trip to Kyiv recently is doing tremendous work. And actually, it shows how sort of well prepared and forward looking some of the Ukrainian civil society are, in that it's at least 4, if not 5 weeks ago now. So at the very, very beginning of the crisis, that a group of young Ukrainian lawyers, human rights lawyers, came through New York, and I sat with them as they discussed how they were looking for insights and expertise in how to go about the evidence gathering. And I must say, the perverse nature of what I'm about to say, that I was hugely encouraged by their seriousness and about their determination to do this in a way that will actually be valuable and clear, hard evidence. We know ourselves, for example, from the situation in Syria, how important it is that overall evidence is gathered in a way that ultimately then can be used when we're bringing these issues forward, for example, in a court. Now, the second point I'd like to make on this is that the basic access to sexual reproductive health care, of course, we argue a human right, lack of access for women in these situations, but we're hearing also about young boys and horrifically about children who've been sexually abused. Lack of access in the initial stages, of course, can lead to horrendous secondary healthcare crisis, and particularly where women are concerned. We've seen that in Ethiopia, we've seen it in Syria now, of course, want to try and make sure that this is addressed in the context of Ukraine. The UN has actually set up what they call blue dot centers all around the borders of Ukraine in all of the neighboring receiving countries, and is looking now for flexible funding so that that funding can actually be used for sexual reproductive health care. We, of course, hugely encourage that and are pushing to ensure that access to resources cannot be used as an excuse for not giving women access to sexual reproductive health care in situations where there has been abuse. Ireland, we've actually ourselves provided €3 million to the Refugee Agency in its work on Ukraine to make sure that they can actually provide the necessary healthcare support and also more generally support, making sure that teams are equipped. When we met with Pramila Patton here, the Special Representative for Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, that's one of the things we discussed with her, that in her work on the ground, she will make sure that in the neighboring countries, as well as in the UN teams in Ukraine, that the teams actually have the expertise, because it's one thing to hear of alleged abuse and to report it in a general way. It's another thing to have the expert capacity. So Ireland is actually, to put it in very blunt terms, putting our money where our mouth is and ensuring there are resources dedicated to that. I think, to say importantly, we've also increased resources to the UNFPA. UNFPA is actually the UN agency mandated in terms of work on sexual reproductive health care, and they are also active in the region and supporting Ukraine. And then the final point, maybe, Coach, we've discussed this both within the European Union, since many of the receiving countries are European, but we're also conscious of this domestically. Receiving countries, national member states, have a huge obligation. It's a fact that not always is that sexual crimes are reported in the immediate aftermath. They may only come to light at some distance from the event. And so receiving countries need to be sure that whatever arrangements are being put in place for incoming refugees from this crisis, that sexual reproductive health care continues through in the support systems being put in place domestically. And we, of course, are doing that ourselves. I know upholding rights to sexual reproductive health care should not be an issue in Ireland. So that's pretty much my best answer to David's question.
Thanks very much, Geraldine. We'll move on to a question now from Gary Walsh from Tropra. Thanks, Gary, for this question. And Gary's question is, on civil society space, Special Representative Gilmore mentions the 2021 resolution at the HRC. Has the resolution had impact, and is Ireland planning follow-on actions to it? So thanks, Gary. And I might go to Michael in Geneva. Michael, if you'd like to come in on that question from Gary.
Yep, very happy to do so. And just to switch back for a second to David Joyce's question, just to say, I mean, and Geraldine mentioned it, but Ireland is one of the major donors to the UNHCR. And from the start of the Ukraine crisis, we have been making the point about sexual violence and about the needs of women for sexual and reproductive health, but directly to Filippo Grandi, because in meetings with them. And they are very seized of it, I have to say. After possibly a slower start, well, obviously it was a slower start because nobody was ready for this invasion, but they are very seized of it, and it is incorporated very much in their work. And as Geraldine says, we have increased our funding quite significantly for their work in the crisis. On civil society space, yes, I mentioned that myself as a high point, our resolution. So Ireland leads on the civil society space resolution and has done so since we were members of the Human Rights Council back 2013 to 2016. And we work in and importantly, it's a cross-regional core group of Ireland, Chile, Japan, Tunisia, and Sierra Leone. And we felt this time that it was important in June 2021 to focus on the impact of COVID on civil society, because it was really clear that civil society space was being restricted as a result of intentional efforts during COVID, and as a side effect also of other actions that were taken to fight COVID. And we also saw that the role of civil society was needed more than ever. So we brought forward in the Human Rights Council, which was meeting, of course, not in person. It's much more difficult operating in cross-regional groups and persuading countries to act when you can't actually meet them, and you can only have virtual meetings. But our aim was, and we achieved it, a consensus resolution in the Human Rights Council on the importance of civil society, and requesting the Office of the High Commissioner to prepare a report examining the key challenges faced by civil society online and offline, and to set out best practices for consideration by the Council. And that is being done and will be presented by the High Commissioner at the session in September. And along with that, Ireland will work, along with the core group and civil society, to organise a side event. We haven't been able to organise a proper side event now in over 2 years, but I'm confident we will now be able to organise a proper full in-person side event in September to really focus attention on civil society space and on the role of civil society. The resolution itself, I think many in civil society would have felt that maybe we could have gone a little further or pushed a little further or been a bit more controversial in that resolution. But I think what we've done is we've got a really sound basis now to have a strong focus involving partners outside Europe and outside the Western group that's a very important point on the role of civil society, because let's be honest, I mean, this restriction of the civil society space became really, really evident in Putin's Russia quite some time ago. It was picked up in other countries. Many regimes in Africa took heart from what was happening. And there is a real crisis of civil society space. So I think having as a basis a consensus resolution for discussions and action by the High Commissioner and in the Human Rights Council in September, I think is definitely a positive. And Ireland has no intention of relenting on this issue. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Michael. Mary, would you like to comment on that question on civil society? There's also a question that we have in from Mission Cara, and let me just bring it up here, from Eamon Casey in Mission Cara, and it's a question about, we hear of funding and resource crises within the international human rights infrastructure, the HRC, special mechanisms, etc. And Eamon is asking, do the panelists see this as a fact or a threat? Mary, if you'd like to comment on that, but also you may have some points that you wish to make on the previous question on civil society engagement.
Well, as you can imagine, I'm all for civil society engagement, and I congratulate the Irish for this resolution and for trying to keep it high on the agenda. I think it's really important to continue to create awareness about the role of civil society and human rights defenders, because if it slips from the agenda, it's more difficult to try and get it back. So, and particularly in these times, you know, when we see all around the world these laws being brought in to restrict civil society and human rights defenders. So, so I'm very delighted that Ireland continues to do this. The question about resources, well, you know, the UN is always telling you it's broke. That, you know, they don't have money, and certainly support for the special procedures. You get a human rights officer, which is great, and then you go fundraising. So I went fundraising, and I currently have funding from the Norwegian government and Ford Foundation. So I'm able to do more than I would have been able to do had it just been for one human rights officer and frontline defenders intern, which the program was set up in 2003. So, but it would be wonderful if there were a way of giving some more support to some of the rapporteurs. The normal way is through junior, what you call them, JPOs, but they're very expensive, and no state really wants to put in place a JPO. I've been very lucky; I've managed to get 2 coming up soon, so I'll be able to do even more work, hopefully. But by and large, it is true that the funding for the UN itself and for the programs that it carries out, and also for the work of special procedures, is limited.
Thanks very much, Mary. Those are significant challenges. Michael, is there anything that you'd like to add in terms of funding and resources for those kind of special mechanisms?
Yes, well, there is, as Mary says, the UN is always telling us that it's broke and doesn't have enough money. But the truth is, I think it's really clear that the budget, the portion of the regular budget that goes to the human rights pillar, is really too low. And Ireland has been among a group of states consistently making that point. The minister has written in conjunction with other ministers to the Secretary General. Now, the answer we get back is there's a limited budget, etc. I mean, it is a struggle to increase the proportion of the budget that goes to human rights, and there is a political element to it also. There's no doubt about that. We all know that. So that's something that we need to continue to work on, and it's something that the High Commissioner is very active and pushing on. I don't know, will she go for a second term, or will she not go for a second term? We'll know that in the summer, but I know that she is working hard with the Secretary General on that. Special procedures, there's a realization, I think, among states, especially those states that support them, that the special procedures need more systematic funding. We saw I think states that were even skeptical about the role of independent special procedures saw during the pandemic how effective they were, and there is a real need to provide more sustainable funding to the special procedures. The thing that I would say is that we at least are now able to start increasing our funding to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Way back in the terrible year of 2009-10, we cut our funding very significantly, and it has been a bit of a struggle to get it back up again. But this year we've really started significantly to increase that funding. So at least Ireland is trying to do something there. But the basic issue is the place of human rights in the overall UN system, and how you fund it, how you resource it, and the politics of that is difficult. And I'd just say we see that too when there are the establishment of various investigative mechanisms, such as for Ethiopia. The first step is to get it through the council here. The second step is to get the funding through in New York through Fifth Committee, and there is often a political backlash comes at that stage also. So the issue of funding is not just about limited resources, it's also very political.
Thanks, Michael. No such thing as just about funding. I think everything is political and politicized, and no more so than at the moment. Mary, we have a question in on the situation of human rights defenders in Ukraine and in Russia, and the questioner asks us what practical support could be offered to human rights defenders in Ukraine and Russia. Is there anything that you'd like to say on that in terms of practical support? We spoke a little bit about it earlier. Mary, I think you're on mute.
Yeah. So when it comes to Russia, it's, I think, trying to, whatever contacts you have, keeping in touch with those contacts and asking them what they want. I mean, what I'm finding is that they really want the situation that they're facing to be publicized and pressure to be put on Russia, you know. But as we all know, Russia is immune to pressure. But at least they want the situation, you know, for example, you know, the closing down of Sphere, that's an LGBTI organization, Memorial International, OVD, the media, independent media, all these NGOs and media, independent media that have been shut down. It's important that where they're still in the country, that, you know, their reports are disseminated so that the true picture of what is happening is known. So I would say anything in that. When it comes to support, obviously, if people need to leave for a while, then giving them visas. Visas is always an issue. Giving temporary humanitarian visas, such as the one that Ireland has in place, to human rights defenders who need to leave for a short time, that would be good. With Ukraine, of course, there isn't the difficulty of leaving, but there are some human rights defenders in Ireland currently who have had to leave, and I would take my lead from them about what it is that they need. For example, with the woman I told you about in Kyiv, who was going 8 a.m. and 8 at night during all the bombing. She had a special pass. She didn't even have a bulletproof vest or a helmet. So we managed to get a bulletproof vest and a helmet and get it into her. Some very practical stuff. But I would go to the Ukrainian and the Russian human rights defenders themselves and ask them how they can be supported. And if I could just mention something else, because it is important, you know, that we're going to talk about it, at least I'm not going to talk about it, but next panel will be talking about the EU draft directive on corporate sustainable governance and the need for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. This will have a huge impact, in my view, on the protection of human rights defenders. It could be a systemic game changer. But it's great. It's both a plus that the draft directive has been published, but it's a minus that the human rights defenders haven't been named as a stakeholder, even though over 300 of them are killed every year. And the Business and Human Rights Centre documented 615 attacks against human rights defenders last year. And we've seen through with the anti-corruption work both in Ukraine and in Russia and in other countries, that it's really important that there is proper participation by human rights defenders, and the companies who are operating in that country, that the human rights defenders should be a stakeholder and in the mandatory human rights due diligence process, and no retaliation should be taken against them.
Thanks, Mary, very much, and again for coming back to those very practical points and some points that the next panel can certainly consider, I'm sure, in their session. I wanted to just mention we have a question in from Maria McManus, and Maria asks, what steps are being taken to advance human rights standards within Ireland to address the needs of citizens, refugees, and those in direct provision? And Maria, thanks for that question. I think the focus of today's panel session is to look at the multilateral environment that we're in. So we're not specifically going to focus on the domestic human rights context in Ireland, but I would just say that obviously the universal periodic review process in Ireland is a really important way in which we look at the application and the accountability of Ireland in terms of the international standards to which we sign up. And in the Department of Foreign Affairs here in Dublin, we work very closely with our colleagues across government in the preparation of the reporting under the different covenants and mechanisms for Ireland's reporting under those processes. And I might just ask Michael briefly if you want to make any comment just in terms of how that pans out in Geneva in terms of Ireland's engagement through the government on those UPR processes, Michael.
Well, yes, absolutely, because we've just completed our third universal periodic review. And I think it's an absolutely vital element of the Human Rights Council, whereby states are subjected to scrutiny on their domestic human rights record, as well as making recommendations to others. So this and indeed our report was adopted while the Ukrainian crisis had erupted and Russia was there, but it wasn't politicized. I think this is one area of the Human Rights Council that has remained sort of as it should be. Like even when the United States had withdrawn from the council, they still allowed themselves to go forward for universal periodic review. So the issues, and I think it has been hugely beneficial to Ireland to have some of the more sensitive and difficult issues, especially social issues that we've had to grapple with in Ireland, to have had a light shone on them by the UN system and by other states in a non-confrontational and non-politicized way. That's the important point. And our review this time, the presentation, the major session, first of all, the preparation was done very much in consultation with civil society. Civil society are very engaged in the process, not just in the preparation of Ireland's part, but as engaging in the process. The Human Rights and Equality Commission actually participates in it. The major issues that have come up this time were more or less as we would have expected. It does include direct provision. It includes the rights of the traveller community. It includes the whole issue of mother and baby homes, and all of these issues have been raised with us and recommendations made, which we have accepted. And I have to say that the main session was led by, it was a cross-government delegation led by Minister Roderick O'Gorman. Because of COVID, it was done virtually. Normally they would have come to Geneva, but it was done virtually. But it actually worked very well because we had all of the represent. Well, I was in Geneva with my colleagues on the platform, and in Dublin we had Minister Gorman chairing a cross-departmental group who were in one place in Ivy House. And I think it was more effective than it might have been. We got really kind of substantive questions and substantive answers, and we've accepted the recommendations and we'll be working on them and have agreed to report back on them. And they do include issues of revision and so on. So I think we felt it was a very positive process, and we felt it was critical that Irish civil society was so engaged in it, because it ensured that the difficult issues in our human rights situation at home were all raised.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think that very much reflects Ireland's approach across both New York and Geneva. All of the agenda that we deal with, we work on the basis of international law, and we apply that to ourselves, and we have the expectation that that is also applied to our partners as well. I'm very conscious of time. I know that Geraldine has to run to a Security Council meeting, so I'm going to ask Geraldine maybe just to say a final word, just in terms of any, I suppose, key points that you would leave with our stakeholder participants, Geraldine, on the pressures that you've seen as you conclude your own term later on in the year in New York, and anything that you'd like to leave with us.
Well, thanks very much, Coach. I mean, I certainly, as Ireland concludes its term in the Security Council, think our commitment to the principles and the vision that drove us to the table would be reinforced, if anything, in spite of everything that we've actually lived through. But I would say that, you know, my clear sense here is a very practical one, that this system, the multilateral system, is really only as strong as we make it. We're believers, but it's not an abstract idea. It's not academic. It's not legal concept. You know, the international multilateral system, if I'm blunt about it, it's a hard slog. It's constant work. It's day-to-day constant support, constant, I would add, critical thinking. We've had to be rather agile and creative while we've sat on the council. And I would add a big, big dollop of a need for political courage in defending what we regard as the important good, the asset we have in the international multilateral system. I'd also just add that the speed at which the system is being challenged is changing, and it's not a truism to say geopolitical relations are more complex, the crises are moving faster. When I look back to the January the 1st, when we took our seat on the council, Ethiopia wasn't a raging crisis. Ukraine wasn't. It was one of those issues we dealt with as an almost also ran issue. It wasn't front and center. The crisis in Gaza hadn't started. Myanmar wasn't on our agenda. Kabul hadn't fallen. So all of those big ticket items that have absorbed so much political energy and attention from us on the council didn't actually, as they are, exist when we moved on to the council. So it's true that it's a much more complicated international environment we're dealing with right now. And I'd add also that the geopolitical tensions at the heart of it, as we arrived 17 months ago to the council, most people on a call like this would have identified the US-China relationship as the one that most of us were focused on. And of course, events have shown us that it's a lot more complex than that, and that other players have a really key role to play. Final point I'll make is that more convinced than ever, if you look at, I keep them in my mind as the 3 C's, the big challenges, COVID, climate insecurity, conflict. None of them can be addressed by individual countries alone. And that's where I loop back to the encouraging news that despite the challenges at the Security Council table, the majority of member states at the UN, and whether we regard the UN as the multilateral system or not, it's a very significant part of it. And the majority of countries at the UN have been ready and politically willing to come together to address those major crises. Our own experience on climate and security at the council, I think, illustrates that in spades. Russia vetoed our resolution. We were the first country ever to have the courage, the political courage, to put that on the table. But it was absolutely clear from the record number of member states, 141, I believe, was the number who supported that resolution in the UN. that people came together to support the case we were making. So I think my overall takeaway is, despite the challenges, despite the anachronistic tools that we're hidebound by at times on the council, there are ways of doing business, and that it's our collective responsibility. And I think it's certainly our respect for the mandate the Irish people give us every day, the Irish civil society, people in the field working on the ground, absolutely oblige us to take seriously every day, that we get up and we make that new effort every morning. Because I think, believer or not, it's the hard work, it's the day-to-day making the case and defending the principles and the vision that brought us here that will make the difference in the end. So step by step, but a firm believer in getting there. And I will sign off, if that's okay. A crisis area that doesn't get too much attention, but that raises both climate and conflict, is the Great Lakes region. That's what I'm off to discuss, and to discuss Sudan. So they won't make the front of the New York Times today, but they are absolutely live and important issues. And hopefully look forward to being able to engage on these and other issues again with the great group who are here today. And thanks for carefully guiding us, Coach. Much appreciated. Lovely to see everyone.
Thanks so much, Geraldine, and the very best with the Security Council meetings, and thanks for taking the time to join us this morning. I wanted to turn finally to Michael for some final thoughts from your end in Geneva, Michael, on the same themes, particular takeaways or points that you would want to leave with our stakeholder audience from your own experience there in Geneva.
Well, thank you. I can be very brief because Geraldine, who has just departed, has said it all. I echo everything that she said. Multilateralism is in a precarious state, there is no doubt. But then maybe it always is in a precarious state. It's not a perfect system, and by definition, if there are crises in the world, it should be challenged. But it is really clear to me, following my time here, and especially the last year of crisis and what we're going through at the moment, that Ireland, as a small, open country, needs multilateralism, and multilateralism needs an active civil society. We can achieve things, but it is a hard slog. And I would just conclude by mentioning one thing that has emerged as a possibility for Ireland, which I thought we might not achieve, was that we've been working on a sort of a cross-thematic area, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Now, the UN Secretary General called a few years ago in some desperation for countries to work on a political declaration that could make a difference in the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We took it on as a facilitator, as chairing such negotiations. We've been delayed by COVID, and it has been a really difficult process. But just before Easter, we had 3 days of intense consultations here in Geneva, involving countries from right across the world, including the big countries that use explosive weapons in populated areas. And I think, the crisis in Ukraine has really drawn attention to just what the impact of this problem is, and the fact that international humanitarian law is not being adhered to. And I think there is a chance we're looking for a final set of negotiations in June. And I think it's not a good thing coming out of Ukraine, but I think people have woken up to the issue. And I think there is a chance that Ireland will be able to finalize that process and get a political declaration on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which should have an impact on actual experience and behavioral change. It's not just words on a piece of paper. That's what I hope. If we do that, we'll have shown that multilateralism can work even in the most difficult of circumstances. But thank you, Coach, and thank you to everyone else participating, and thanks for the questions. And I was going to say I look forward to next year's Civil Society Forum, but I won't actually be here in this job. But maybe I'll hear about it. But thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Michael, and I'm really pleased that you made that point on AWIPA and our work on explosive weapons in populated areas, because sometimes I think disarmament issues and the work that we do on that is regarded as quite technical, and actually I think what we've seen through that work is just what a human impact those issues have on people's lives, and we're very hopeful that we can make some progress in that area, and certainly that would be a very bright point, I think, for 2022 if we could make that kind of progress. I'm conscious that we're now trespassing on the time of the second panel, and my apologies for coming to you slightly late, but I do want to finish just by really thanking Michael Gaffey, our ambassador in Geneva, Geraldine, who's departed now for the Security Council, and particularly Mary Lawler, our special rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. You've been absolutely fantastic, both in giving your time and being so reflective and thoughtful in terms of the interventions that you made. And I really wanted to thank all of the participants who posed questions. My apologies, we didn't get to all of them. There were many of them, and they were very diverse. And thank you very much for that. And I know we'll have many that we will come to next year. And we hope to bring back in honorarian roles those panelists who've been with us today, even if they have moved on from their current positions. And we wish them all the very best, particularly you, Michael, as you finish up in Geneva. And thanks for all of your work there, and to Mary as well. So thank you very much, everybody. We will conclude this panel now, and I'm going to turn it over to Jerry Cunningham, who's going to guide the next panel discussion. Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you very much, Cote, and also to echo the thanks to Geraldine, Michael and Mary for a very thought-provoking discussion. And I think actually you've sown the seeds there for this next discussion on the importance of the multilateral system, on the importance of human rights for business and human rights, for human rights defenders, for environmental protection. And I'm glad to see that the panellists, who I'll introduce in a moment, have been listening very carefully in the background. So I'm sure we'll have a good consistency between the two discussions looking ahead. So just to introduce our panellists this afternoon, to start with, Gus Hooton is the Senior Trade Advisor in the European External Action Service and chairs the OECD Multi-Stakeholder Steering Group on Responsible Minerals. He focuses very much on due diligence in supply chain and responsible business conduct from a Brussels and a global perspective, and also monitors countries' performance on human and labour rights and environment under the EU's general scheme of preferences. So a lot to contribute again from the EU perspective there. From the domestic perspective, we're very happy to be joined by John Shine, who currently heads up the Company Registration and Regulation Policy Unit within the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, which includes responsibility for a number of legislative initiatives, including the proposed Directive on Corporate Sustainability and Due Diligence. And previously, John has worked in a variety of roles within the department, all related on the wider public sector areas dealing with issues of competition, consumer protection, internal audit, EU structural funds, industrial policy and ICT. So again, very well placed to advise us today. Caoimhe de Barra is well known to many on the call this afternoon. Caoimhe is CEO of Trócaire, a very well-known Irish development and humanitarian NGO working in partnership with local organisations to tackle the root causes of poverty, injustice and violence to achieve social justice across the world. Caoimhe has some 20 years leadership in frontline roles in global development and humanitarianism, and to add to her cap, she has also part of the founding member and chair of the Irish Consortium on Business and Human Rights. And great to see so many members of the consortium on the call here as well today. And also from the National Action Plan Implementation Group. Thanks to so many for joining. And also on our National Action Plan Implementation Group, IBEC is a key part of that group, key part of the stakeholders representing the employers and industry in Ireland. So we're very glad also to be joined by Cara McGann, the Head of Policy at IBEC, which is Ireland's largest business representative body. Cara's role very much involves providing strategic advice on labour market, equality, diversity and inclusion and well-being policy and practice to employers. And she is very much engaged both nationally and with European stakeholders on the area of social policy, from areas such as the gender pay gap to reporting on labour market activation. So I am very pleased that we have such an extensive panel, a panel I think that represents, like the National Action Plan, a very broad range of stakeholder interests. And perhaps if I could kick off the discussion, perhaps turning to each of the panellists, asking them perhaps just to, on the general concept of business and human rights, to ask each of you, my apologies, to speak a little bit about your involvement in this area and your organisation and why it's so important and currently on your radar. Perhaps we could start with Gus, then Caoimhe, Cara and then John.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and thank the ministers, excellencies, and dear friends for having this EU official on this important call. Well, I'll keep my comments to the EU legislation for later in the discussion, but my background, I'm trying to reflect those points in my statement. 10 years of due diligence experience in the minerals sector with the work of the OECD, with the work of the UN. My comments will be 100% personal. They will mostly reflect positions of the Commission, but I cannot exclude any discrepancy. And just on the point, which was, I was on the verge of trying to intervene in the previous discussion, but I want to raise one important point, and I put it also in our internal comments. The role of the special rapporteurs is vital. If it hadn't been, for instance, for the work of Rona Smith, we would have had, I would say, considerable trouble in establishing a well-founded withdrawal decision on our GSP, everything but arms privileges for Cambodia, including for violation of ICCPR rights relating to civic space. Well, then the work in a way, it's strange, of course, to have somebody from the Foreign Office talking about responsible business conduct. But with me, it became automatic because I was called by the cabinet of Commissioner de Gucht, long time ago, whether I would be willing to lead the ES involvement in the minerals regulation and the minerals communication. I'm avoiding the word conflict minerals, because if you're a company and you're sourcing, you don't want this to be portrayed as sourcing from a conflict area. Although we have a list, a public list, people may not know that, a public list of conflict affected and high risk areas for the purpose of the minerals regulation. You can imagine that was read with considerable interest by countries such as Mexico, with whom at the same time we're updating our free trade agreement. Due diligence is not new. What is new, I think, is mandatory and cross-sectoral due diligence. And we have a bit of experience in legislation at the level of the EU, France with its law dating back to 2017, and more recently Ireland in 21. Sector-specific, there is not so much hard legislation on due diligence. We're still in the early days. The conflict minerals, I'm using the word conflict minerals because that is how you still see it on DG Trade's website. Not a great thing. 2017 regulation. The batteries regulation, a common position just finalized, I think it was late March by the Council, and I assume they are now deep into conciliation with the Parliament. Let's be frank, and also, I'm not going to talk about the legally binding instrument, which is being negotiated or not negotiated in Geneva, but worldwide, there is little or no uptake of mandatory due diligence. There are a few exceptions closer to home, Norway, Switzerland, and also in the US with the Forced Labor Prevention Act. And in a way, although it's Africa focus, the Dodd-Frank Section 1502. Even the Chinese have minerals guidance. I'm stressing the word guidance, inspired by the OECD. What is applied on the ground is, however, a different matter. If you look at Chinese, I would say, exploitation in Africa. There is hard legislation in a number of countries. The Democratic Republic of Congo's mining law incorporates OECD guidance. What we will, and I'm looking ahead also at our legislation, there will be an important external impact on developing sourcing countries. Of course, the objective is two or threefold even. We contribute to sustainable development worldwide. We stop the race to the bottom. And also a bit of a selfish argument, we'll try to level the global playing field for our companies. And inside the EU and outside the EU, try to get the laggards on board. However, as I said before, it is still early days when it comes to putting mandatory cross-sectoral due diligence into practice. And our proposal is not only human rights, it's also environment. And I think this novelty goes even more strongly when it comes to environmental due diligence. And for the practitioners, easy to remember that in the OECD due diligence guidance on responsible sourcing of minerals, I'm stressing the word responsible, from conflict-affected and high-risk areas, environmental impacts and risks were not even explicitly listed in the so-called Annex 2 risks. So that is only 10 years ago, when we were not even thinking in international instruments about environmental risk. Well, over the last 10 years, they coincide with my 10 years of work, but I've only been contributing in a very, very minor way. But we've seen increased company uptake of due diligence, but still less uptake by governments across the entire policy front. Governments may even set due diligence rules, which is fairly easy. It's not rocket science, but they also need to deliver on creating the enabling environment with good governance, with development assistance, with political pressure and policy coherence across the board. And I've also always put the message clear, loud and clear, that due diligence can and should not be a ticking the box exercise. We don't want to make this a bonanza for, sorry if there are any consultancy companies on this call, but we don't want to make this into a bonanza for consultancy firms. We need inclusive due diligence, and even on the EU legislation now being proposed, we also need to avoid de-risking. De-risking is a failure of everything you're doing. Luckily, and that is a novelty, the Commission's DG INSPA, formerly known as Development Cooperation, now has identified supply chain sustainability as a priority for the latest cycle of EU development assistance. And I'll make a few political points. And again, I'm trying to avoid at this early stage of the discussion the EU draft directive. But whatever may be the extent of due diligence obligations, or how far up the value chain are we going, the value chain coverage, the upstream operators, and those happen to be in many cases the poorest, will be affected. And there will be the important issue of cost sharing of due diligence. And not even on the mineral sector, we've been able to come up with a workable solution to that issue. And we need to make sure that the buck doesn't stop with the most vulnerable in the supply chain. For instance, artisanal and small-scale miners, or cotton farmers, just to name two. And of course, this may sometimes seem trivial for the downstream industry compared to the overall cost of doing business responsibly, but it's essential if you want to have long-term sustainable development in sourcing countries. Again, our development policy and our foreign policy need to do their part. But, of course, you cannot, many of the issues our companies are confronted with in third countries are systemic and require a major move by our government interlocutors. So we also need to address, as governments, as European Union, the lack of governance in a number of sourcing countries, because whatever may be the impact of due diligence legislation, it is not enough to make fundamental changes. So in short, we need this smart mix, as advocated by the late John Ruggie. So again, we're working on those to enhance coherence in the implementation of the UN guiding principles, clarify sustainable reporting obligations. We're even considering or working on banning products made with forced labor, amongst others. But again, a warning. We have a tendency always, and again, it's linked to my comment on the consultancy bonanza, let us not be too EU-centric. We need to avoid that due diligence requirement decided at the end of the day by the downstream industry and by the downstream government become an unrealistically high entry barrier for upstream operators. Again, it reminds me a bit of the general system of preferences, or the GSP plus. If we want, we might consider withdrawing a lot of those preferences, but we have adopted the concept of progress over time to help countries move up the hill. The same thing, we have to be careful with the new due diligence legislation. I won't make any comments on the legislation at this stage, and I've been already too long. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you very much, Ngos. I will come back in more detail for the actual details of the draft legislation or draft directive, but I think you're making a very important point about a balance that protects the rights of everybody at every level of the supply chain, and particularly those who are the most vulnerable. Caoimhe, on your side, Trócaire is very much at the forefront in working in many of those countries, and from the perspective of the International Coalition on Business and Human Rights. Can I ask you maybe to, as well then, just to say a few words on how this touches on your radar screen at the moment in both roles? Thanks.
Jerry, thank you very much. And firstly, can I just thank and congratulate the panel that went before and all the speakers there who have given us excellent insights into the state of the environment for global human rights work, and specifically for human rights defenders right now. So thank you to all the previous speakers. As you mentioned, Trócaire is the chair of the Irish Coalition for Business and Human Rights, which is quite a broad-based civil society coalition, and it brings together organisations working with human rights defenders, overseas development and humanitarian organisations, environmental organisations and trade unions. And the reason why we have come together is because collectively we have witnessed increasingly over the last number of years, and constantly firsthand, we've witnessed the impacts of corporate harm on the communities with whom we work everywhere around the world. And these harms include human rights violations such as forced labour, land grabs, attacks on human rights defenders, both physical and other attacks, violence against women, and denial of people's fundamental rights at work. And we're also seeing significant environmental harms coming through the corporate value chain. So whether it's deforestation, dumping of toxic waste, oil spills, unchecked carbon emissions, and widespread destruction of biodiversity. As Trócaire, as the CEO of Trócaire, I have on many occasions been in communities where I have witnessed and spoken to people who have been directly harmed, and especially human rights defenders. In fact, just before the COVID lockdown took place 2 years ago, one of my last visits was to Honduras and Guatemala, where I spent time on a hillside with members of a community who brought me to the graves of 2 other members of their community that had very recently been killed. Other members of the community subsequent to my visit there were taken away and imprisoned for almost 2.5 years, simply for peacefully protesting against logging and the taking of water from their land. And these are indigenous people who are subject to protection, special protection under the ILO Convention 169, for example, but rather than protection, actually what they were seeing was gross victimization. And we see that as the coalition across all of the countries that we are working in virtually, from Central America, South America, throughout Africa, Asia, and the Middle East and other regions. So what we're seeing is that, the worst excesses of this results, as Mary said, in the killing of human rights defenders. So 2020 and 2021 were amongst the 2 worst years ever for the killing of human rights defenders. But also, just to touch on the topic of gender that others have mentioned in the previous panel, just also to put on record that female human rights defenders in this area are particularly acutely affected. And they're acutely affected because of their status as women in their communities, because to take a stand as a female leader in a community is a risk in itself. But then also when you're taking a stand against corporates and against potentially a cocktail of complicit security forces, governance forces, women are at risk, their families are at risk, they're told that their families are at risk. It is an extremely dangerous thing to do, to take a stand as a female human rights defender. But this is what we are dealing with every single day as the entities within the coalition. So that's why we believe it's so important to work on this topic. And what we see is that there is a huge disparity in power between corporations and affected communities. And this couldn't really be more stark. And it's not just power that we see between maybe international global corporations and local corporations. You see huge power being wielded in a way, it was mentioned earlier that you have this sort of, you have through COVID, but also prior to COVID, the rule of law is being eroded. So you have a toxic combination of both a disenabling environment for civil society, but an enabling environment for corporations that are willing to act in a way which breaks or directly evades laws, and often with the complicity, as I mentioned, of military forces or police forces. The complexity of corporate structures and the elaborate supply chains that exist, they compound the difficulty in holding those responsible to account. And that's particularly important for impacted communities who are trying to seek justice. So if they're trying to seek justice and justice is not available through their own court system, through their own system of governance, it is equally almost impossible for them at the moment to achieve justice through global systems. And the uncomfortable truth for us is that many European companies are linked to human rights abuses and environmental harms. Certainly by no means all, absolutely not. But there are many European companies that are linked to these abuses through their global value chains. And indeed, a number of businesses based in Ireland have been linked to human rights abuses. And we as the coalition we've produced a report called Make It Your Business, which highlights some of those companies, including now infamous Cerrejón mine in Northern Colombia, which is linked to the ESB and to CMC here in Ireland. Airbnb is another example. But I think rather than focusing just on examples, one of the most telling issues here in Ireland is that when Trinity did a research report into 60 of Ireland's top companies, they found that over a third of those companies scored 0 on inclusion of human rights in the due diligence that they were doing within their own internal supply chain. So it shows that there's a huge amount which is simply unknown within corporates around how are their supply chains actually impacting human rights. So I think the reliance to date, I think we would all acknowledge, on voluntary measures hasn't been affected. 10 years ago, we were extremely excited within Throatground, within the community, around the Ruggie process and what it had delivered. But the reality is, and this is well recognised, documented, including within the European Union, that asking corporations to police themselves, in effect, has failed to systemically prevent abuses from happening. And this is why we as a coalition are very encouraged now to see the emerging shift from voluntary approaches towards mandatory legal requirements for business. We don't think it'll be easy. We don't think it won't be complex. Of course it will be. But what we do see is that this new proposed corporate sustainability due diligence directive is important because it will require companies to introduce robust and systematic due diligence checks, where companies will have to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address both human rights and environmental issues throughout their supply chains. And just the last thing I'll say, Jerry, before turning back to you, is that I completely agree with Ngos that this legislation, it's essential that it goes beyond a tick box approach. That cannot be the outcome of it. When we introduce these new rules, what is very important is that we consider what is meaningful. And to be meaningful, the legislation needs to be transformative for the communities on the front line who are experiencing the human rights abuses. Jerry, let me pass back to you.
Thanks very much, Caoimhe, and a lot of, I think, correlation there with the first panel discussion as well. Thanks for that. Cara, I think it was Ngos who mentioned that sometimes what we see internationally is companies getting ahead of government, so maybe there's a lot more we need to do on our side. On the other hand, Caoimhe has just mentioned lots of work still to do for many Irish companies. Could you maybe just, in terms of the radar, fill us in on where the different companies are in Ireland and their understanding of the business and human rights agenda, from the big multinationals to our small and medium enterprises? It'll be really interesting to get that perspective.
Certainly, Jerry, and thanks very much for bringing this together. I suppose maybe to take a step back and say where IBEC is in all of this. So I'm involved in this area at a national and European level. We sit on, as you said, the implementation group on business and human rights, overseeing the Irish National Action Plan and also giving effect to the UN Guiding Principles. Within IBEC, we have a cross-sectoral employers working group across the issues of this whole area of corporate sustainability, due diligence, really sharing that good practice. As you say, there's a lot going on in this area, but it's also, it's very useful from our perspective to inform policy positions. At a European level, we're involved with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive file, among others, and we're working, I suppose, with other member state employer representative groups, with Business Europe and Digital Europe, on these various human rights issues and files. So there's quite a bit of work going on in the background, I guess, also on these particular areas. More generally, IBEC is also an active member of the International Organization of Employers and the ILO, and is very mindful of the importance of human rights to how we do business for individuals, societies and organizations alike. And it very much fits with IBEC's focus on environmental, social and governance agenda, which really sees sustainability as core to competitiveness, because we can't have a thriving economy if we don't have a healthy planet and a more equitable society. And business plays a really key role in shaping that more sustainable future. And I think in addition, we also know that more and more investors, customers and employees are really choosing to work with organizations that respect and have a good track record in human rights. So it is a win-win for all to have human rights as a central element of long-term business, sustainable business practices. Having said that, you know, while there's a lot of really, really strong work going on, and I can talk to the types of issues, if you like, that different companies are engaged in, what we see is that people are coming at it from a number of different areas. You know, I think we've seen the whole area evolve considerably, if you like, since the early days of the UN Guiding Principles, which I suppose are more than a decade old at this stage. And we've seen a growing number of companies really making an explicit commitment to respect human rights, or to have actions in place to look at their human rights performance. Quiva mentioned the Trinity Research report, and I think it was very, very interesting. But what I think it also showed, and it was certainly in the caveat of the authors of the report, is sometimes we're not using the same language, so we're not being as clear about it. And we need to have a way to report and to be transparent about what we're doing. But it isn't a one size fits all. And certainly some companies are very far advanced in this area and others still need work. And the breadth of the issues covered by the term human rights is extremely broad, you know, covering everything from the employee rights, the freedom from discrimination and harassment, the minimum wage standards, equality, and so on. And some organizations are really strong in those elements of the agenda, while others are more broadly focused. So as I say, it's an area that we've seen progress, but we've still a lot of work to do.
You're on mute there.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Cara. And I think a useful reminder that from the business side, it's the predictability so that everybody can reach the same crossbar, as it were, in terms of operating at that same high level. I'm going to turn next to John with really the same question on how this is coming across the radar of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. As Ngos has mentioned, there's been decades of engagement on mineral conflict, diamonds, etc. The DET is very much involved with OECD on multilateral guidance as well. Do you want to give us an insight into that, John? And we'll come back in the next round of questions to the EU due diligence recommendations.
Yes, and thanks very much, Jerry, and good afternoon, everyone. And just like firstly to thank Jerry and his colleagues in Department of Foreign Affairs for the invitation, and delighted to participate in the panel discussion on behalf of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. Just being mindful, I suppose, in the context of sort of good use of time, I won't repeat any of the comments I might have made that have already been made by other participants. I suppose just to say that, you know, from the department's perspective, I mean, you know, firstly, I mean, the department is very keen to promote responsible business conduct. In the broader sort of an ESG agenda, I mean, it has been, you know, very active across a whole range of areas, specifically in the context of, you know, the business and human rights area. The department has been participating in the implementation group in relation to the national plan. The department is also the national contact point for the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And then the department, across the whole, across the breadth of its activities, is involved in a whole range of other areas and initiatives relating to sustainable development goals and climate action, trade and sustainable development, workers' rights, including ILO engagement, and then more generally in the area of and more broadly in the area of corporate social responsibility. Specifically, and I come from the company law side of the house, and specifically in that context, you know, there are two particular initiatives. One is the current corporate sustainability reporting directive, which is at trilogue stage in Brussels, and that follows on from the non-financial reporting directive. And then secondly, and of particular relevance to myself, is the corporate sustainability due diligence, which I won't get into in any detail now, other than to say that that specific proposal comes within the responsibility of my area. So that's something that I and my colleagues will be working on very closely over the next number of months and years, in fact. So I might just leave it at that at this stage.
Thank you, John. And we'll come back on to explore how that might develop in the years ahead as well. Then in further round of questions. But maybe now, if I could turn again back to the panel and look at assessing some of the major changes that have taken place in recent years, and perhaps starting with Ngos at the EU level, and then maybe to hear from the country perspective a little bit more from Caoimhe, and then nationally from the perspectives of Cara and John from your own stakeholders. So maybe Ngos, that you just say a little bit more about the changes that we have seen at the EU level and the implications of those.
Thank you, Jerry. Well, first of all, let me repeat what I said implicitly already. I'm personally convinced that mandatory due diligence matters. I started out this work with a completely different perspective, I would say ruggy based perhaps, but when we proposed as Commission, and we worked closely with the Commission as ES, the minerals regulation, one may remember that it started out as a voluntary due diligence scheme. And it was due to the pressure of the European Parliament that we finally adopted a mandatory due diligence scheme. So in a way, I would say the 2017 regulation on minerals was the real let's say starting point for a completely different approach. And again, the early days, there are developments, of course, and I think John also referred to the other legislation being discussed. But we should not be forgetting that the hard obligations for importers of minerals, and they're only tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold. The hard obligation only entered into force on the 1st of January 2021, which is not even 1.5 years ago. So we're looking at a fairly new development. And I also remember, in terms of changes, as MSG chair, I can of course be independent from the EU, from the Commission, that the latest edition of the minerals guidance makes it absolutely clear that it is not limited, the guidance, to the minerals on which there is sectoral, let's say, appendices available. So it applies to rubies, it applies to precious stones in general, it applies to other minerals. Hence also the pressure by Parliament to increase the scope. Again, the directive is taking that change further, in my opinion. I'm personally a fan. I've worked for as a legal advisor to the Council of Ministers, so having to defend what we did or what kind of mistakes we did as EU legislators in court. And I'm personally a great fan of regulations. And again, like I said, sometimes I don't represent the Commission thinking, so I would have preferred, although legal difficulties, the current proposal to have been a regulation, because that indeed creates a true level playing field and gives you more leverage also abroad. The good thing of the directive, and don't get me wrong, it is an important directive. There's a strong reference to international standards. There are, I would say, broad attempts to align on the core due diligence steps, notably developed at the level of OECD. And don't forget, those developments at the OECD are a joint exercise of civil society, OECD Watch, at business at OECD, and all the OECD membership, including, of course, an increasing number of South American members for the reasons you all know. Of course, we do not have in our legislation to mirror OECD guidance or UNGPs 100%. They've been tested, that at least they work. But the moment you make, and there's a strong argument made also by, I think, Commissioners Reinders and Breton, indeed, the guidance is important, but at the end of the day, it's our legislation that matters. The good thing is that there is a whole of value approach, with a caveat, however. This is only for value chains of direct established business relationships. But still, whatever we do on the value chain has an oil slick effect. It has an oil slick effect upstream, but it also has an oil slick effect downstream for those companies not in the scope of the directive. It's only the larger and larger companies, or the really large and larger companies with a risk profile. There is a general inclusion of stakeholder engagement, albeit not always perfect. There is a broad human rights coverage, and a focus on prevention, putting an end to harm. You know, all the concept well known of due diligence, inclusion of penalties in this case also for non-compliance, and the powers for supervisory authorities, and last but not least, civil liability. And it has accompanying measures, major tasking for the Commission, I would say, for the years ahead, alignment of schemes and SME support. But of course, at the same time, I'll be a bit more critical here. There have been comments by practitioners, by scholars, and by those that will ultimately decide about the directive, by member states, by members of parliament. At least a number of those I picked up. I would say, first and foremost, the concept of established business relationship will require some hard drafting work still. Perhaps we should better frame that in relation to core value chain. And the risk-based approach and a definition of appropriate measures may not always clearly link prioritization to the severity and the likelihood of impacts, because that's what you should be doing as a company. It's a risk-based approach. Where am I likely to do harm? Severity and likelihood. And there might be also an over-reliance on contractual clauses and social audits in the discharge of due diligence, and as a safe harbor mechanism even. Let's see how it develops in the context of civil liability. All this might, I'm saying might, favor short-termism, so short-term relationships, diminishing leverage, because what are we going to want to do with due diligence is also to create leverage for our companies. And again, as I said earlier, this may also be promoting box-ticking approaches to compliance. There is certainly much work, and I'm not a civil law specialist myself, as you may have noticed, but work for the civil law specialist on liability for due diligence failures and how this relates overall to damages under tort law. And a comment, an absolutely personal comment, I would say the annexes, notably the human rights annexes, clarity could have been better. We're mixing rights, prohibitions, and a sometimes even incomplete list of conventions. So this creates a tendency to focus on the annex and perhaps, I'm saying perhaps, forget about the risk-based approach that you have to identify the likelihood of severe impact. And we also need hard work by the EU institutions. And if you look at the directive, you'll find a few articles requiring really hard work. Article 13, guidelines on specific sectors or specific adverse impact. There's a hidden reference, luckily it's there, ILO to the UN, so get those on board with the experience. Article 14, accompanying measures, helping inter alia joint stakeholder initiatives. Based on my minerals experience, this is essential but takes time. We have little official and supported by the EU examples. The EPRM is just one. So you could say, okay, our work with the European Partnership on Responsible Minerals may find a place also in Article 14. And then 15, the guidance for assessing the fitness of industry schemes. And here you see a bit of experience with the minerals regulation. What did we do in the minerals regulation in order to make life especially for those outside the scope, the smaller companies. If you're a small company, difficult to have 1 or 2 full-time compliance officers. So we, together with the OECD, we developed the alignment assessment of industry schemes. That found a place in the minerals regulation. I'm personally involved with the consultant, with DG Trade, with the OECD, in the alignment of the current 5 schemes that have registered for alignment. We still have to approve the first one, hopefully in May or June, because they were sent back to the drawing board. But that is a terribly time-consuming exercise, but at the end of the day, it will allow I would say, the reputable industry schemes to help not only improve the situation upstream, but also to help the smaller companies deal with this issue. So the whole collaborative effort advocated by John Ruggie. Our experience, I'm not sure if the Commission was ready, let's put it that way, to assume the same level of responsibilities with the current human resources. And I'm very curious how this will develop in Parliament and in the Council. So I would say the directive is groundbreaking. Any innovative legislation comes with teething problems, but I rely on the collective wisdom of Council, Parliament, and of course, Commission. Finally, because we're in a civil society forum, there are references to stakeholder consultation. If you look at Article 6, for instance, Article 8.3b, Article 9, the complaints procedure, but there are a lot of ifs where appropriate. Of course, that is compatible with the risk-based approach. So I think there's also work for civil society at large to make sure that one is involved also at national level in the risk assessment. And I think the national authorities who will have to deal with the implementation of the directive and of course transpose it into national law will have to keep an eye open on I would say, the proper stakeholder involvement. Again, too long again. Sorry, Jerry.
Thanks, Ngos. I think you're giving us the masterclass, and a lot of us are listening with great interest into those insights, because I think it is very important for those of us who are getting to grips with the new directive. But turning to the other members of the panel and maybe picking up on Ngos's remarks there, Caoimhe, to say a little bit about, from the perspective of the international coalition stakeholders on the ground, the changes that we've seen. Although Ngos says in the case of conflict minerals, the lesson is that these take, I suppose, a long time to get actually implemented, and it's probably a short period of operation in practice. But in the meantime, there will be a whole spectrum of companies, those who are proactive and those who've been at the rear guard, I suppose. Maybe to say a little bit from the coalition's perspective, building on your previous comments about how you've seen the companies adapting to that, and indeed local communities as well.
Certainly, Jerry. No, thank you very much. I mean, I think I'll make 3 points. So one is just to ground our consciousness in the kinds of environments that we're talking about, within which human rights violations can so easily occur. So to give an example, this time last week, I was on a call with our entire team in Guatemala, and the big issue that they wanted to bring to my attention was eviction. So eviction of community members, indigenous people. 60% of the population of Guatemala are indigenous people, and they are being evicted in huge numbers from their land in order to make way for corporate investment. Mining. Some of these are Guatemalan companies, but they all have foreign investment. There's a lot of Canadian investment. There's a lot of investment from many places going into Guatemala. And their big cry was, how can we address this? We feel that this is completely beyond our control. The courts are no longer responsive to us here in Guatemala. A lot of the progress made post-peace accords, that has all been dismantled. So they feel, in effect, very much abandoned by their own system, but also saying, how can this be addressed through the international system? I think, to take an example of a case that was also shocking and appalling, and that continues to be shocking and appalling, but where a company did try to do the right thing ultimately, is the case of Airbnb, which is in the coalition report that was released there just before Christmas. So Airbnb, which is headquartered in Ireland, as people will be aware, has you can make a booking in a settlement in the West Bank, and these are recognised, including very strongly by the Irish government, as illegal settlements. And to do business in an illegal settlement is absolutely clearly not within allowable bounds at all. Airbnb, to their credit, after many years of bringing this to their attention and advocacy around the clear illegality of this, decided that they were going to actually suspend their operations in the West Bank. It was clearly just absolutely untenable that land that had been taken away from Palestinians was now being rented to Israelis or other foreign visitors, but could not actually be rented out to Palestinians, who were the original owners of the land. However, what happened was that when Airbnb went to suspend their operations in the West Bank, they were challenged by the Israeli court system. So this is the reality that we are facing, is that there's huge complexity within country environments. So if there was a company that wanted to do the right thing, but that went against other forces within that country, then they might be stymied. And that is why what we actually need, because this is a global issue, it's not merely a European issue, what we actually need ideally would be a binding international human rights treaty at the UN level. And this is something that our coalition is very much in favour of. We recognise that there's a long road to achieve that as well, but it would be very important to achieve it. And we do hope that now that the European Union has come out with this directive, that will give a more strong basis to the European Union taking a good solid position on the UN treaty, because we do not see these things in any way in opposition. In fact, they should be fully complementary, and they should build on the Ruggie process, of course. But we all recognise now that the voluntary nature of that process has delivered very, very, very little. The last thing that I'd say, my third point, is that this is actually something that increasingly businesses are getting behind. So as Cara has said, and you've said yourself there, Jerry, what corporates need, what the private sector needs, is predictability, a level playing field, knowing what the rules are and knowing that nobody can drive things downwards and not actually be affected by that. Just very recently, 100 companies and investors signed a statement calling for support for a robust legislation. And actually, interestingly, and I know we'll get into this in the next subject, they actually said that this should apply to all businesses, including SMEs. And the statement acknowledged that, in effect, responsibility for human rights and the environment, it's not a matter of company size. And this is something that we as a coalition would strongly argue as well, that human rights violations are not down to what the size of the company is. It is down to a huge host of factors around vulnerability, risk, what is the, what are the risks within the environment. And that is not really predicated on the kinds of thresholds that we're seeing that I think we'll probably discuss in the next session. But just to say that the private sector there's been a sea change in attitudes over the last 10 years towards ESG in general, but in particular, there's a call out for robust legislation around supply chain due diligence.
Thanks very much, Caoimhe, and I think that's picking up on Cara's earlier point on the transition, I suppose, from environmental and sustainable governance to actually implementing a mandatory approach going forward. Cara, and then John, just from your stakeholders' perspectives, to ask you again just how your stakeholders are adapting to that or see responding to some of those major changes, and what are the demands you're seeing. And I'll ask John the same question, but also conscious, John, that some of the stakeholders are semi-state companies as well. And we have, I know from our national implementation group, some good practice in terms of public procurement. Lots more to do, but lots to build on as well. So maybe to start with you, Cara, please.
Certainly, thank you. Maybe just to build on some of the earlier points that the other panelists have mentioned. I mean, I think companies understand the importance more and more of becoming more sustainable and addressing these kind of risks. And I think we have seen a lot of progress, as I said, over the last decade or so. I mean, if I look at our membership within IBEC, even just one aspect of this whole agenda would be the whole area of, let's say, diversity and inclusion. And we look at equality, diversity and inclusion. We bring employers together to discuss this, and our active membership in the last 18 months alone has grown 120%. So these are employers, some who've been with me nearly 14 years working on this agenda, but others who are newer to the area. So it's as I say, it's only one aspect of this whole brief, but they're fully immersed. They're making a difference in working on key issues around everything from gender balance, cultural diversity and anti-racism, disability and reasonable accommodation, LGBT plus issues, often in countries where equality in that area isn't legal, and so on. And we saw also too, through the pandemic, organizations' ability to flex and work differently with their employees and focus on mental health and well-being to a huge extent, and how to disconnect. And obviously, there are some who are doing very, very strongly in this area, and others who have more work to do, but are certainly conscious and making efforts in this area. And I think responsible businesses are keenly interested and really committed to this work. And it is a mammoth undertaking to be across all of the broad human rights areas, and it does take real work, but it also pays real dividends, I think, to the businesses as well. And that is very much in the awareness of business. I think we've seen a sea change too in the generation of employees and future employees, and their interest in businesses being a source for good and in driving social impact. And so they will vote with their feet, and they can, so that is in the awareness of business as well, if a business case per se was required. I think we've also seen the commitment to business and human rights really demonstrated in different ways, such as, the increase in organizations going through different standards, whether it's like Business in the Communities, Business Working Responsibly mark, others working on the various frameworks like the UN Guiding Principles, the OECD M&E guidelines, and others working proactively, I guess, with NGOs and campaigners to really challenge their thinking and look at where their blind spots might be. Because while there can be tensions between businesses and NGOs, their engagement is important as constructive skeptics, I guess, as they challenge and they bring good ideas to the company, and they often serve as an early warning system for new issues. So I think we've seen a lot of progress has occurred and is in train, but I think we still have a lot of work to do. I think we're still looking at in some pockets, awareness raising on the how and the what to focus on, as Caoimhe mentioned, the complexity that's within the system. So I think that is certainly an issue for some. I also think we need to support, in particular, the whole area of respecting human rights, especially for SMEs, who may not have the resources or the supports already in place. So we need to make sure that we're constantly evolving and we're constantly learning in that area and supporting businesses to do more and go further into the areas that they've already started down. So as I say, a lot of progress I think we've seen, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Thanks, Cara. And then turning to John, and just to mention, just before Easter, we had our Heads of Mission conference with presentations here from Taoiseach Leo Varadkar as Minister of Environment, Trade and Employment, and a very strong message on our new trade strategy about, particularly in the current context, Ireland's values being more important than ever. And as colleagues will know, we work very closely with the Department of Enterprise, particularly on a One Ireland approach as much as possible overseas with colleagues in Enterprise Ireland and elsewhere. So maybe to get that perspective from you, John, the growing awareness within the wider government and within the wider business community as well.
Yes, thanks very much, Jerry. And again, I suppose at the risk of repeating what has been said by others, and to an extent, that's the curse of coming last in the panel. But yeah, I mean, look, I think it is a very, there's a broad spectrum out there. I mean, in general, I think it's fair to say that, there is widespread support and recognition by business of, I suppose, essentially, doing the right thing and wanting to do the right thing. And various businesses are a lot of progress has been made in various areas. So, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, for those who are involved in the non-financial reporting directive and soon, to develop into the corporate sustainability reporting directive, I mean, they're sort of already well in this space in the context of non-financial reporting. Something that struck me actually from recent media commentary, I think it was one of the Sunday papers in the last few weeks, and there was reference to the fact that ESG related issues are featuring more, in remuneration committee consideration of packages, for the CEOs and senior management. So, that's sort of hitting people in the pocket. So it's certainly for CEOs of companies, where that is part of their package, that certainly focuses their mind. Now, that's not to say that should be the be all and the end all, but I suppose it is just sort of indicative of, even at the sort of sharper, corporate end of matters, that it is sort of having a material impact. This is a very busy sort of a regulatory and policy space, and we've heard of the various initiatives, whether it be from a soft law guidelines perspective or a more hard law perspective, and then sort of lots more coming down the track, including, for instance, the day that CSDD was published on the 23rd of February. The Commission also announced their intention of producing legislative initiative in relation to forced labour before the end of the year. So however complex it is, at the moment, it is going to become even more complex. And I think one of the challenges, for business is, it's sort of trying to get to grasp with all of this, and trying to understand how all of these various initiatives coexist, and I suppose a real desire to ensure that there is sort of coherence and consistency across the piece. Another issue that's been raised is, as we've heard already, just the whole desire of having a level playing field, and the importance of having consistency, so that business is clear as to what is expected of them. You mentioned semi-states, Jerry, and that's just been one example of where progress has been made over the years. But it is sort of a mixed picture, and I think certainly it is fair to say that for smaller companies, the understanding and appreciation of the potential impacts that their value chains mightn't be as well understood, and particularly bearing in mind the very complex value chains and the international nature of those that we're dealing with at the moment. And I think that's probably going to be a particular challenge, so that while people may well think that they are doing the right thing, they mightn't fully appreciate some adverse impacts down the value chain. I think the other thing to say is that for those who might have been somewhat reluctant or maybe less enthusiastic in the past, they would also have been sort of the nudge factor from those who are both upstream and downstream of them. They're those with whom they do business are also very keen to sort of progress ESG related matters, and that's also one of the contributing factors here. So I suppose maybe just in summary to say, it is while the vast majority certainly of responsible business is very keen to do the right thing, I think there's a certain degree of uncertainty out there, and possibly bewilderment is going a little bit strongly, but I suppose certainly a desire to see how all of this hangs together, and certainly a desire to ensure that whatever requirements are on business are clear, and are consistent across the various legislative initiatives.
Thank you very much, John. And I'm reminded the importance of the Sunday papers. We've also seen quite an emphasis on the subject matter, I suppose, for Irish businesses in light of Ukraine and Russia as well. And very much coming from a stakeholder and a consumer perspective, I think is a growing, so as Cara said, growing interest from employees within many of the companies as well, but growing interest from a wider range of stakeholders. Before we go on to the final question to the panel, it's just great to see so many questions coming in. Please continue to pop them into Slido. Really, perhaps maybe for the final question, maybe Gus, if it's possible to get into a little more detail on the draft directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, where you expect it will go. And I guess we're seeing huge expectations around it in the first instance. Perhaps it's fair to say a guarded welcome in many quarters for the directive. Some expectations, as we heard there from the earlier panel, that this is a game changer. And you know, really, it would be interesting to see your perspectives on that. Were the challenges for the Commission in getting it over the line, and what might be the challenges and I know it's very early days, but the initial responses from member states? And then I'll turn back maybe to each of the panel and ask them maybe just to respond on that as well from their perspective. Thanks. Sorry, Gus, we just need to unmute you.
So, thank you, Jerry. Sorry for that. No, it is indeed, it has a large degree of speculation, but I would say what I've heard so far, and again, the external relations team, and that it ranges from DG INPA, DG Trade to the ES, is not as such the Commission representative in the working party where the actual, I would say, consideration of the proposal takes place. It's DG's Just and DG Grow. But what I hear is that there is no fundamental opposition, and you've seen, of course, discussions in Parliament. I think the draft report being prepared, a recent meeting in Parliament with international or with EU experts on where are we heading with the legislation. So for me, this is something I'm fairly certain that there will be a compromise reached between Parliament and Council. Earlier than 2023, probably not. And then, of course, comes the transposition deadlines for the member states. So I would guess that before this actually is translated with national implementing legislation and all in hard obligations for our companies, we're looking at a time frame probably of at least 3, probably 4 years from now. But irrespective of that, and we've seen exactly the same a similar phenomenon with the minerals regulation, is that the shadow of the implementation date for the hard obligation for the minerals regulation adopted in 2017, this was the 1st of January 21. So again, a good 4 years already. That made companies change their behavior. I would expect the same thing were going to happen here. And I see indeed many questions popping up in the chat, indeed, also about the actual percentage of companies to which this would apply. Again, there's a huge oil slick effect. I'm giving you one example. When after the adoption of the minerals regulation, but before the hard implementation, I visited one of Belgium's larger metal recyclers, completely outside the scope recycling of the minerals regulation. Still, their larger customers and even private customers asked them, can you demonstrate to me where this metal came from, whether there was a smelter outside the EU involved? So again, it would nearly require it. I think it required the company also to become part of an operational industry scheme, because I think they had one and a half persons dealing with compliance. It was just too much for them. So that is going. I'm less worried about the percentage of the industry, and I'm giving the example. Well, again, it's a mineral example, completely unrelated in that way, but I think of the tantalum and tin export from the DRC. I'm not saying that that the sourcing is actually fully compliant with human rights, but nearly 100% of the companies and the exports are covered by the national certification, regional certification scheme, and supervised by industry scheme. So you're seeing a development on the ground, a long term, which has happened, and that happened already. That percentage reached before the EU legislation actually became operational on the 1st of January 21. So I'm probably too much of an evangelist in this area, but I'm fairly optimistic. Of course, when there is no EU leverage, when there's only industry, I will not name any specific countries around, we will have problems. And I'm just reacting to what, I'm not sure where it was in the Slido or a comment by one of my co-panelists. Of course, the legally binding instrument in Geneva is important. And I've said so, including to the coalition in Geneva. Okay, once we get more clarity about the marching orders, we will most likely engage. We're now partially engaging, which for any negotiator is an impossible job. But we should ask ourselves the question. We put the bar relatively high at EU level with our legislation. A number of countries will certainly not be able to accept that level of engagement in Geneva when it comes to a legally binding instrument. And assuming we can put the issue of only multinationals, as advocated, for instance, by the Chinese, behind us. I think the South Americans are much more open, but we need to realize, okay, what kind of instrument will allow the Chinese, the Indians, some of the South Americans from this world to sign up to an international instrument. And that's a discussion which has not taken place yet. It has not taken place in Geneva between the like-minded and others. It has not taken place in Brussels. So I'm using this occasion to also urge the government to press for such a discussion. And I would say in terms of there are certain governments with an interest because they already have the national legislation. Still, I'm not seeing a clear push for the EU to engage, but engage after having had a discussion about the fundamentals. Easier said than done, but that's something we need to be doing before there can even be a question of having a negotiating directive adopted by the European Commission.
Thanks, Goose. We could probably deal with a whole other panel discussion on the LBI, but I think it's very useful for the people on the call today to get that insight into it as well. I'm going to turn next to Caoimhe, perhaps to come back on the response on from an IC BHR perspective. There are, I suppose, a lot of comments out there from civil society that the directive does not go far enough. What I suppose is the realistic balance of what can be achieved and I see a couple of questions coming in. I'll just touch on some of them briefly. We have questions about, do we need to include GHG emissions in the list of environmental impacts? The directive applies only to 1% of businesses, whereas long-standing UN OECD standards require proportional due diligence by all companies. So maybe just to get that perspective from the coalition, and then I'll come back to a couple of the other questions with John and Cara as well.
Jerry, thank you very much. Yeah, maybe I'll just touch on maybe 3 or 4 key points, because we could spend quite a long time talking about the detail, which is very interesting and very important. But I mean, first of all, the bottom line is we really welcome this initiative. Been waiting for it for quite some time, and it has the potential to be absolutely groundbreaking. But it only has that potential if it's followed through on in a serious way, in a way which will actually have a positive impact on the kinds of communities I spoke on earlier. And we do see at the moment that there are some very significant weaknesses and flaws, some of which have been mentioned earlier in the draft text, and that would risk the text not just being ineffective, but potentially actually counterproductive. But let me maybe just go through a few of them. So first, the scope. So the scope is very problematic. As one of the questions mentioned, it only applies to 1% of businesses. So if the scope with the thresholds it currently contains were applied, 99% of European Union businesses would be excluded from these new rules. And here in Ireland, where we have many thousands, of course, of companies, fewer than 700 Irish companies would actually be required to assess their supply chains. the thresholds are extremely high. It speaks of very large companies, which are companies with over 500 employees and over 150 million turnover. And then it includes large companies, but only in 3 high-risk sectors. And those sectors are agriculture, garment, and minerals, which is also quite reductive in terms of high-risk sectors. And the thresholds in those are also equally quite high, over 250 employees and 40 million turnover worldwide. But what we know is that actually, as was mentioned earlier, this really needs to be risk-based and it needs to be considered on a proportionate basis. So we would not argue that every organisation needs to have exactly the same standard applied to it in terms of the rules it has to follow, not the rules, but in terms of the procedures, but that it needs to be proportionate in line with UN standards. But certainly we believe that there is a huge task to do in terms of revision of the thresholds that apply, because otherwise it will be de facto meaningless, because so many companies, 99% of them, would be excluded. And that's to the disadvantage of those companies that would be excluded, but that are trying to improve their practices and are looking for legal certainty and want to get out of a race to the bottom. Secondly, we're very concerned about dangerous loopholes within the draft directive. So again, this was referred to a little bit earlier, but the draft directive currently implies that companies could, in effect, fulfill their due diligence obligations by adding certain clauses in contracts with suppliers, which shifts the risk and shifts the responsibility to those suppliers. And currently, the draft directive leans very heavily on companies' ability to use auditors. So use, if you like, social audit companies to, again, it's risk shifting. So if they use these social auditors, and who those social auditors then say, yes, we believe that you are operating, without any infringement of violations of human rights. First of all, it removes actually any responsibility from those individual businesses themselves, but also, there's a long history, and it's quite well documented, of the lack of reliability of those forms of social audit. They are not regulated in themselves. So we think that is deeply problematic. There is another loophole that is very problematic, which is that the businesses currently in the directive text are only required to assess their supply chains for what's termed established business relationships. Now, you can understand that, of course, trying to develop something which is workable, but established businesses relationships, as it does not in any way cover the full extent to value chains. And in fact, what it risks doing is creating a negative incentive, a perverse incentive towards a system where companies would limit their risk by moving supplier very regularly and prioritizing short-term suppliers and informal suppliers. And we know through our experience, but it's well documented globally, that it's in informal work where we see the worst labor rights abuses. So this leaning in on established business relationships is deeply problematic. It is bound to incentivize exactly the kind of behavior that the European Commission and the Parliament is trying to avoid, is trying to move away from. And what they're trying to incentivize, ideally, is strategic business relationships that are based on a strong partnership and that are based on sound practice at all ends of the value chain. Thirdly, in terms of access to justice, it was mentioned again earlier, just obliquely or in passing, that there are actually significant barriers to communities being practically able to take complex cases against EU companies. So while we wholeheartedly support the inclusion of civil liability within the directive, it needs to address the barriers, and the barriers being things like within the specific legislative environment of the country within which the company is actually incorporated. It needs to be made clear how the burden of proof must not be shifted to the communities who are impacted by the human rights violations, that there needs to be absolute clarity around how those communities can effectively take an action, so that there's a fair distribution of the burden of proof, that time limitation periods for bringing claims are reasonable, that there's collective redress mechanisms for groups of people, as is almost always the case, who are affected, and that also that the claimants are supported, because again, we are talking about extremely poor communities in the main that are affected by the kinds of violations we see. And then my last point is that meaningful engagement with communities, it is quite, given the progress we have made over the last 20 years in ensuring that norms and standards at UN and at OECD level focus so much on what real, meaningful, effective engagement with communities means, it's really disappointing to see how weak the draft text is on meaningful engagement with communities, including, as Mary Lawler said earlier, the protection of human rights defenders. And then I said it was my last point, but I can't finish without mentioning gender. It is completely gender blind. It makes absolutely no reference to the fact that women and their experience within supply chains can often be very different to men's experience. And it is not to say that there is a hierarchy, but it's just to say that that has to be taken into account. Thank you, Jerry.
Thanks very much. Caoimhe, quite a lot there in the summing up as well. Cara, any final responses or any of those questions you'd like to pick up on from the IBEC perspective?
Certainly, yeah. Thanks very much, Jerry. I think first off, maybe to say that business absolutely welcomes the focus on this area and really understands the importance. And it's essential, I suppose, with that acknowledgement that the directive is workable and proportionate and effective and provides legal certainty and this true level playing field that's being discussed. And I think there's a number of challenges to this within the directive as it's currently written. And again, maybe I can touch on maybe 4 points. As I said, business supports the introduction of this common set of binding legal requirements with a view to combating, I suppose, the growing internal market fragmentation that we're seeing in the European market, given the different national rules in Germany, France, Norway, and so on. And so rather than having to deal with a patchwork quilt of legislation, having one overriding harmonised EU framework that levels the playing field is really important. However, as it's currently written, it allows member states not only to retain the existing disparate rules, but to go further if they desire, which is the absolute opposite of what the intention was supposed to be. So it is really important that we have that proper harmonisation. I think secondly, the nature of international supply chains, as other panelists have mentioned, is that they are complex, and to get raw materials from their starting point to their end point can include several different actors, and you can have responsibly sourced materials mixed in with other materials without a tracing mechanism. So the focus really needs to be on the due diligence processes and the identification of risks and potential harmful impacts. That risk-based approach, which I think Ngos mentioned in the beginning, should be applied as described in the UN guiding principles. Otherwise, the requirements might trigger superficial and inefficient due diligence. You know, if we're legally requiring companies to allocate resources to broaden and deepen due diligence throughout multiple supply chain tiers, we could result in resources being spread too thin or becoming inadequate to address those risks in areas where companies have most influence through their direct business relationships. I think thirdly, the CSDDD can't be seen in isolation from other tools such as the OECD M&E guidelines and the UN guiding principles, you know, and indeed the existing or upcoming European climate and circular economy and environmental policies, as well as the sectoral schemes that strengthen the role and engagement of companies. So that coherence with other EU due diligence measures, whether adopted or ongoing, is absolutely paramount to avoid duplication and confusion. Maybe just to touch on the scope question, you know, even if, you know, SMEs are out of direct personal scope, if you like, it doesn't mean that they won't be impacted. You know, in practice, they'll be indirectly affected as suppliers in the supply chain and will face massive challenges in that. So, you know, they have less influence on the supply chain due to limited resources and less market power. So it's important that, you know, that is acknowledged in it. And when we talk about that 1% of EU firms, it doesn't actually mean 1% of total turnover. You know, the proposal will more or less cover all companies in the European economy for different reasons and have the far-reaching consequences for their ability to compete in an international market, because it's projected that the companies in some of the sectors in the scope make up as much as 70% of that sector's total turnover in certain member states. And finally, maybe just to touch on some of the definitions within the directive are quite vague and unclear. And this is an area that we really do need that clarity and certainty on for organizations, but also for those monitoring the situation. You know, the terms like business relationship and established business relationship and preventing adverse impacts and bringing adverse impacts to an end. These and others are unclear and vague and seemingly contradictory in some cases, and as such would be operationally difficult to apply. So more work needs to be done there, because if we end up with a non-workable due diligence framework, it'll not only seriously damage Europe as a business location and harm the competitiveness of companies, but it'll endanger the full goals of sustainability. You know, so it is essential that it's workable and doesn't make companies responsible for factors beyond their sphere of control or which stray into the role of the state. the UN guiding principles had 14 guiding principles for business, but a similar number for the state, clearly identifying that business has a significant role to play in this, but obviously cannot and should not have to do this alone. So I think this is something we are supportive of and absolutely see as the way forward, but we have to maybe look at it again and see how we can adjust further.
Thanks very much, Cara. And turning to John then next, we have, I suppose, a very complex but very important directive that the government will now be taking forward, and it's still early days in looking at the complexity of that. But it would, I think, be useful, even based on previous directives or guidance, I suppose, to give an indication to people on the call as to the possible next steps and how consultation will be taken forward in Ireland. And perhaps to link it into one or two of the questions there, I see colleagues inquiring about how the consultations will include civil society. And there's also a question, even though it hasn't really kicked off in Brussels yet, how Irish government will engage with the EU Council on taking this forward as well. What will be the engagement mechanisms in Brussels? Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. A few points just before I specifically address what you've asked me to. This is a very complex and I think challenging directive, and I suppose, as evidenced by the fact that I'm sure most people are aware, it had a, to say at least, a challenging process, through the European Commission, which resulted very unusually in 2 negative opinions from the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. So irrespective of what people may think about it, it has got a lot of consideration within the European Commission over a considerable period of time, including a very extensive public consultation process. So I think it is fair to say that the European Commission would be well, without wanting to speak for them, I'm sure they would be well aware of the varying issues that would have been expressed. In terms of where we go next, and how the process evolves, we're at the very, very early stages of consideration of the proposal at working party level in Brussels under the French presidency. The process is initially it is seeking clarity, from the European Commission, in relation to various aspects of what has been proposed, including, I think, the vast majority of issues that we've already heard of in terms of scope, in terms of issues with due diligence, in terms of the practicalities of how this might work, particularly when there are very complex value chains, and possibly several elements of those value chains within the EU or involving EU companies, and to ensure that there's sort of coherence and the avoidance of unnecessary duplication and so on and so forth. So we're very much at the stage of seeking clarity and looking to fully understand how the Commission actually sees this working in practice. And one of the things we have been keen to look for is sort of practical worked examples of how this might actually work, bearing in mind all of the complexities that we're talking about. So in terms of process, it's still, as I say, at the clarification stage. Then it will go into sort of an article by article examination, and that will lead on to drafting. And taking on board changes to what has been proposed, and that will ultimately lead to a general approach at Council. Our sort of working assumption at this stage is that consideration of this is going to continue into the forthcoming Czech presidency, and indeed into the Swedish presidency in the first half of 2023. So we're expecting a general approach possibly in the first half of 2023. Thereafter, it will go into trilogues. So we may not see a final directive until the latter part of 2023. That's sort of our sort of working assumption at the moment. And then, there would be the transposition period. In terms of how it will be transposed in an Irish context, it's too early to say at this stage, and whether it be by primary legislation or statutory instrument. And to an extent, it'll very much depend on the final directive that emerges. Just a few other general points. The Minister has already started engagement on an informal basis with various stakeholders, we have met with many of the participants on the panel over the last while, and will continue to do so. The Minister actually, as recently as yesterday, in a commencement matter before the Seanad, for the objectives of the directive, and his desire to ensure that the proposals, did strike the right balance, and to ensure that they were effective, in addressing the adverse issues, but also that they were clear and proportionate and enforceable. We're at the start of, I think, what is going to be a long road, specifically on the point about engagement, with civic society and with stakeholders. We're at the, as I say, that process has begun on an informal basis. And for instance, the Minister met with the Coalition on Business and Human Rights, a delegation from the Commission last week. We've also met last week with IBEC. We have other meetings over the next number of weeks. And that's all sort of just simply part of sort of an initial, engagement process. But that will be followed by a more formal consultation process in due course. We haven't finalised our thoughts on that yet, because really we would like to get sort of more a better understanding of many of the issues at Council Working Party before we got on the consultation route. But the Minister has committed to doing a public consultation, and in fact we may well have more structured stakeholder engagement as well. That's certainly something that we have done, and the Minister is very keen to do. He has done it in relation to the CSRD last year. And it's also likely to be something we will do in relation to the CSDD. So, we would certainly see ample opportunity for engagement, both of the informal and formal nature, during this process. But again, just to emphasise, it is at the very early days of the process, which may well be a frustration for those who are keen to move on. But as I say, this is just really reflective of the difficulties in getting to where we are, and I suppose really just fully appreciating the thought processes behind what we currently have and how it's expected to work before we look to take things any further.
Thanks, John. And it's really useful to hear about, as you say, early stages, but those consultations, the ball is already rolling and moving forward. And hopefully today's discussion feeds into that to a certain extent as well. I want to give credit to quite a number of questions that have come in, some of which we've touched on. I'll go very quickly through them and ask the panel maybe each if they want to pick up on one or two. But we had one from Olive Moore in Frontline Defenders that where in many places in the directive it indicates that due diligence and consultation engagement with stakeholders says where necessary. I think, Gus, you partly responded to that, but if you want to come back in a minute, I'll give you another opportunity. David Joyce has put in a question about whether the draft directive rewards reluctant businesses and punishes those who are most compliant and committed to due diligence. I don't know, Cara, if anyone, Cara or anyone else wants to pick up on that one. Cara, you kind of picked up on a question there from Sorka Tunney on the Irish Coalition, that the alignment with the UNGP and OECD guidance, and you highlighted the very same concern actually from the business stakeholder group, that it's important that we do have as much harmonisation as possible. And then another question, two final ones that I'll mention in this round. Olive Moore, again in Frontline Defenders, mentioned the protection for whistleblowers and whether that can be broadened. Goose, I don't know whether that's something that's come up in your earlier discussions. And the final one on my list at the moment is from Peter Gaynor, essentially about a minimum living income or a minimum living wage, and whether there are opportunities to include that. So whether the the panel have views on how you legally include, or whether it's automatically included, minimum wages compliance with legal requirements in each of the countries in which the supply chain operates. Ngos, can I touch with you, and then I'll invite each of the others to signal if they want to pick up on any of those questions. Thanks.
See, I think it works. Thank you, Jerry. Well, I can only, in a way, share the concerns. The stakeholder engagement elements, I think, can still be improved in all the due diligence articles. I can only assume that the as relevant as appropriate is the drafters' interpretation of the risk-based approach. So if you're serious about identifying the risks or the most serious impact, it would de facto require stakeholder engagement. But still there is room for improvement, and I would not rule out that this will also be one of the suggestions, having heard what has happened so far, suggestions being made by the European Parliament. And of course, there is the problem again of industry schemes, this reliance on whether it's social auditing, including industry schemes, without any hard verification. What are the, I would say, the basic requirements to establish the fitness of those industry schemes? Article 15. And I fear that the absence of going the extra mile for having a form, it doesn't have to be a full alignment assessment as we're doing on the minerals regulation, which indeed is in fact, at the end of the day, it will give those schemes, I would say, the approval, a sign of excellence. This meets with the EU regulation, this meets with the basic steps of due diligence as developed notably by the OECD. But there could be intermediary ways in order to make sure that there is a minimum requirement, and that's why I refer to hard work by the EU institutions. If we do not have it in the actual compromise between at the end of the conciliation process, trilogues and conciliation process with Parliament, we need to think of what kind of guidance are we giving, because the guidance will also inform the national authorities and actually going into any ex ante or ex post checks on the company behavior. So there's a lot of, I would say, in a way, and because that's also normal in very complex legislation, there is a degree of kicking the can down the road with obvious risks, but also challenges for the work of the Commission in establishing that.
Thank you, Ngos. And then to any of the other panelists who'd like to pick up on any of the questions?
Jerry, I might jump in if I may. So I'd like to come back to the issue of scope, because I do think that's one of the really key ones. And, you know, it's just, of course, there's going to be an awful lot of teasing through the detail with the European Commission, as we understand from the description of the process, and that's very important. But I think, you know, just to underscore what the private sector are saying about scope, you know, the private sector that is behind this, and that's a large proportion of the private sector, is saying proportionality is key. And they're saying SMEs should be included. And in fact, there's research by the European Commission itself within the last 2 years that says that the additional recurrent expenditure required for SMEs, so not large corporations, but SMEs, as a percentage of their revenue, in order to, to actually put into effect the type of due diligence that will be required of SMEs, so proportional, would be 0.14% of their turnover. So this would be proportionate. Proportionality is key, and that is what was required at the UN and the OECD level. So I think that is something that, you know, the coalition would really believe that the Irish government and the Irish parliamentarians, our MEPs, should really back, really supporting that the UN and OECD standards are supported throughout this entire due diligence process. I also think, just with respect to the time frame, so of course all of these processes, they do take time, But there's a number of different points I'd make, maybe two overriding points. One is that the Dutch government, as far as I understand, has already actually produced a position paper with their perspective on the different key areas, so scope and liability. So, taking the power into our own hands seems to me like a sensible thing. So from the Irish perspective, it would be, I think, very positive if the Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment, in consultation with the other relevant government ministries, would actually lead out, given that we've already had a degree, as John has already said, of informal consultation, would actually lead out on developing a clear policy position from Ireland that sets out, well, what do we believe is an appropriate directive from Europe? And that should include, as I've just said, the standards around UN and the OECD standards. Then maybe just in terms of the national work, because again, I thought it was really interesting what Cara said, that companies will be anticipating this and they will actually start looking for guidance, more than likely in an informal way from IBEC or from others. So I do think that it would be timely and wise to progress, based on that consultation, to progress looking at, well, what are the key areas of existing Irish law that might need to be amended or expanded? And taking John's point that it is very early days, but at the same time, there are key issues like access to justice through the Irish courts for third parties overseas. What might that look like? What are the implications in terms of human rights standards and international law? Department of Foreign Affairs, area of responsibility, company regulation, Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. I mean, what we want to be is ahead of the curve on all of this. And that is both with the intent of being able to, as early as possible, protect the human rights of communities that are affected by negative outcomes in supply chains, but also by giving companies that are incorporated in Ireland the security that they're looking for. And bearing in mind as well, and this is probably my last point, that Ireland punches above its weight because we headquarter so many global multinational corporations that what happens in Ireland matters beyond Ireland. And given our status as a company that really holds firm to values and principles of human rights law, and we discussed that earlier and it was a really positive discussion, I think that's where we should be. We should be nailing our colours to the mast and saying, we want to be amongst the vanguard of European countries that are really pressing both for very strong European directive, but also preparing the ground here in Ireland as early as is feasible and reasonable for a strong transposition into Irish law.
Thank you very much, Caoimhe. Cara or John? Have we said everything that needs to be said? John, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jerry. I suppose just to pick up on that point, as I said, I mean, the Minister has already sort of indicated that he's supportive of the objectives of the proposal and is keen to ensure that what is what is ultimately agreed is effective, and appropriate. So I mean, in that context, the department will certainly be keen to sort of develop positions, engage, understand and develop. So, we certainly haven't, we're conscious, as has been said, of the work by the Dutch on this, who have been, one of the countries at the forefront of developments in this area. But we're certainly keen to ensure that, we've ambitions also in relation to, what we would ultimately like to see, coming from this proposal. If I could, just to pick up on one thing that was mentioned earlier, I think it might be about Caoimhe in relation to industry schemes, and there was reference earlier to, cascading and the potential of sort of, cascading out of responsibilities and so on and so forth. And that certainly is something that has arisen. And I think it's also mentioned in the context of risk shifting. And I mean, this, again, this is a really, really complex area. It's something we're sort of working at European level to try and sort of fully tease out and understand. Because I mean, on the one hand, nobody wants a tick box exercise, right? Okay, and certainly, from the department's perspective, if we're going to invest a number of years in sort of, engaging, negotiating, and ultimately legislating, what we want at the end of the day is something that is impactful. But I mean, on the other hand, there are real practical issues here for our business, and particularly when there's multiple layers, in the value chain. So I mean, certainly the way we would look at this, I mean, we don't see any inherent difficulties per se with with industry schemes, but I mean, the issue is how credible, how effective they are, and the extent to which those schemes themselves need to be audited, or that there's adequate oversight over them, and so that whole thing, I think, still needs to be sort of fully teased out. So I might just leave it at that.
Thank you very much. And Cara, then any final remarks from yourself?
Thanks, Jerry. Maybe just to comment on David Joyce's question about whether the directive kind of rewards reluctant businesses and punishes businesses who've invested. I'm not quite so sure that I'd go so far as rewards and punishes. I think certainly, business is looking for something that's reasonable, clear, transparent, and workable. So tightening up the language, but having uniform regulation. But it would be to the advantage of business to have this internal market fragmentation taken care of, that harmonization approach. So the intention of where it's going, I think, and having that framework to work with is very important. I do think, as we've said before, drawing on the what's existing already and has been, that companies have been working with already is also equally important. And maybe, recognizing further, existing sectoral standards and so on. All of that is very, very important in all of this. But certainly, I think it's going in the right direction, and I think the support of business is certainly there for it. Those who are already doing the good work, I think we can learn from. I think we can, learn a lot from the good practices that are already done, and I think we need to make sure we do that to understand what's working well and what isn't working well, and then to see maybe where the gaps are. But I think there's certainly a lot of really good practices already in place. We should be building on that. We shouldn't lose that and lose that ground that we've already made. Thanks.
You need to come up mute.
Sorry. And a point to build on that, perhaps, that in a competitive business environment, we should be very much encouraging businesses to support them in exchanging and sharing best practice as well. And certainly that's, I suppose, a key role for government partners and in conjunction with IBEC itself. That has been, I think, a slightly longer panel than we anticipated, but I think because it was such a rich and a comprehensive discussion, it's been so valuable to have the perspective from each of the panelists. So I will do a quick summing up in a few minutes. But before I do that, my very sincere thank you to all of you for joining us today, both from Brussels, from our colleagues in the Department of Enterprise, from Covet on the stakeholder side, and Cara as well on the IBEC side. It's been really useful to get that full perspective, and I think builds a good platform, set of foundations for going forward. In terms of just trying to justify the earlier discussions, I suppose just to say at the beginning, we're very grateful that the Minister very much set the scene, talking about Ukraine and the devastating impact of the conflict there, but also reminding us, and again reiterated by other panellists subsequently, that does not distract us from, I think it was Eamon Gilmore mentioned, the other 22 crises, or perhaps it was our UN colleagues, the other 22 crises featuring at the Security Council. And indeed, Geraldine and Michael all spoke about the work they are undertaking in many of those very severe crises, from Ethiopia, Yemen, Myanmar, Libya, Palestine, many more, whether it's in terms of the conflict or in many cases a growing humanitarian and even food security crisis. We're very grateful to have Eamon Gilmore with us, who really, I think, addressed the recession in human rights and gave us some worldwide, and really gave us some stark reminders about how gender is now become a source of argument in the multilateral system, how journalists and media freedom are being threatened, and how the threat from disinformation as well, while civil society space is shrinking. And he gave us some very, I think, stark reminders of where we are in the world with democracy today, saying that we're back at the level that we had before the Cold War, with 68% of the world's population now living in autocracies. During the first panel discussion, Ambassador Byrne-Nason spoke to the vast impact the war in Ukraine has had on our work at the Security Council, but again pledged that Ireland will continue to stand with Ukraine while maintaining our engagement on many of those other crises that feature at the Security Council. Ambassador Gaffey in Geneva likewise added how the situation in Ukraine is similarly dominating the agenda at the Human Rights Council, and is likely to continue to do so even with the withdrawal of the Russian Federation from the Council. But he also again emphasised, and again a common point coming in the earlier discussion, was the importance of accountability across a number of these appalling human rights situations worldwide. We were very fortunate to be joined by Special Rapporteur Mary Lawler, and we're reminded how fortunate we are that we have 5 Irish rapporteurs in the UN at the moment. And she, I think, spoke again to a theme that cut across both panels on the importance of the protection of human rights defenders, whether that's in Ukraine or Russia, or whether it's indigenous communities or women human rights defenders facing multinational businesses in remote areas of the Amazon or whatever. And I think a common theme coming back again across the panels about ensuring access to justice for rural communities against the companies which may be headquartered in very different parts of the world. Some very important points, I think, again, coming out in the earlier discussion on conflict and sexual related violence in conflicts at the moment, both in Ukraine and many of those earlier conflicts that we mentioned, and the importance of the accountability mechanisms, the human rights investigations, the commissions of inquiry, to follow up with those and to be able particularly to support the women and children who have been most affected, and the importance of securing that evidence so that accountability mechanisms can ultimately be successful. We did hear some of the high points, both from New York and from Geneva, whether that was the civil society. And I suppose when you talk about human rights, it's important to measure those achievements. As Mary Lawler said, some of them can be small. It can be better conditions for one person in prison, or it can be a better situation for a much wider community. And hopefully the resolution on civil society space in Geneva will contribute to that as well. The panel discussion on the UN again concluded really with the importance of multilateralism. And again, I think that's something that cuts across to the other panel. The second panel then, as we've just heard, focusing very much on business and human rights. It was first of all great to have John join us from the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. I think really timely to have that. As we said, it's early days in terms of the receipt of the draft directive, but really useful heads up and I think an input across the panel onto how we take it forward and how that consultation mechanisms will be developed in line with previous legislation that has been developed. And again, to recall, former Minister Gilmore's spoke himself to the importance of this directive and the importance of including activities that focus on minimising child labour and exploitation. I think Gus very much echoed this perspective, underlining, I think all the panellists underlined the significance of mandatory measures and that this is now actually a key request or ask from the business perspective themselves. All panellists, I think, really highlighted the importance that the approach to due diligence is no longer voluntary and should not be seen as a box-ticking exercise. Inclusive due diligence is essential, and we need to avoid the situations where corporations take a de-risking approach. And we heard about the further changes that civil society and indeed the business community would like to see to the directive going forward as well. Particular thanks to Gus for, I think, what was a very valuable insight, not just into the new directive, but to the history that has informed and developed it as well, because that will shape the further development of the directive, certainly here in Ireland, and as we heard, the importance of harmonising that as much as possible with OECD and UNGP guidance, and also ensuring that we have the widest possible consultation with all the stakeholders involved. Thank you very much to Caoimhe, who really set out the stark situation facing many communities, particularly in rural areas across the world. And I think underlining the need for a strong text which sets out a very clear scope, which avoids some of those loopholes such as shifting risk, which prevents those perverse incentives back towards a gig economy. And again, as mentioned earlier by others, ensures access to justice and ensures effective engagement with the community. And again, a directive that ensures that the businesses taking it forward do so in a way that is very conscious of gender bias in many areas as well. And finally, thank you very much to Cara, who gave us a very, I think, welcome perspective from the Irish business, and an indication of the eagerness that's there to be able to engage with that, and how it's in the best interests of Irish business and indeed of Ireland Inc. to be able to play a lead role in that. So with that, if you'll bear with me for just 2 minutes, maybe on a few housekeeping issues of interest to other members on the call today. I think it was in the first discussion we had a question on about how Ireland engages domestically on human rights and how we are held to account ourselves for our commitments. And Michael Gaffey spoke to the Universal Periodic Review that happened earlier in at the end of last year, and was adopted in March of this year in Geneva. But also to highlight that as a signatory of many of the international conventions, we are regularly reviewed. And on the 4th and 5th of July this year, the Irish government will have a delegation in Geneva for the 5th periodic review of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And again, the Department of Foreign Affairs will coordinate much of the response on that. The Office of the High Commissioner is very much inviting civil society engagement. So we will be in touch with colleagues, particularly on the Department of Foreign Affairs NGO Human Rights Committee, as to how they can engage with that going forward. And secondly, just to mention that we do hope very much to be in touch with the members of the Foreign Affairs Committee to highlight hopefully a date in the second half of May for the next meeting of the Foreign Affairs Human Rights Committee. Finally, with that, to add my thanks very much to all the speakers, the panellists today, and to everybody who has joined on the call with the very useful, I think it was very active, very engaged questions, which added a lot to the discussions. And it was very evident in the thoughtful and very well-informed contributions. And finally, just to thank my colleagues both here in the Human Rights Unit for ensuring everything went to plan, and our colleagues in ICT as well, who, apart from my omissions to unmute the microphone, otherwise had a pretty much a perfect setup. So with that, thank you. I wish everybody a good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We will look, hopefully, next year to a physical meeting at the 21st Civil Society Forum. Hopefully we will be in Dublin Castle and can have the best of both, with a physical meeting with perhaps some guests able to join us virtually as well. And I very much look forward to being part of looking in on those discussions, and very much listening to hopefully the progress that will be made in the intervening year on the promotion and protection of human rights. So with that, thank you all so much, and Gurv Mila Maghav Golair.